Hello and welcome to another stream of Frenchman Learns About the History of Japan, and this is the 5th stream on the Sengoku Jidai. We're almost at the end. I think I've already got another one planned tomorrow, I think. No, the day after, maybe. Wait, I already forget when I planned it. Well, I've got one either tomorrow or the day after, and I think that might be the last one, potentially. I guess we'll see. I mean, you know, we're getting toward the end. We're at episode 43 and there's 64, I think. You know, Japan is almost unified. Edonobic, what's up? So yeah, as always, we're watching the videos by the great channel, The Shogunate. Link to the playlist with all the videos in the description. The link to my Discord, my stream element, my Patreon if you want to follow, support me, or request reaction. But yeah, last time we really advanced a lot, and obviously we've reached the point where Nobunaga is dead. Mitsuhide is dead. Hideyoshi is now the shogun and basically the leader of the nation. We finished last time with the conquest of Kyushu, which was kind of anticlimactic. It just, you know, they just had no chance. So I guess now all that's left is basically some of the clan in the, you know, the north, I guess, of Honshu, and I don't think they will pose much of a threat at this point. I mean, it's basically done, yeah. And I guess looking at the title of the videos today, yeah, I guess we're gonna do the Imjin War, which I know some about because I'd watched a video about it once. So, I know that it's an attempt to conquer Korea, which I didn't actually realize it was during the Sengoku Jidai. I always thought it was like later or something. It seems kind of crazy to do this right now, you know, like, I guess Hideyoshi finishes, you know, unifying Japan and right away he goes overseas. That seems like a terrible idea. Korea, Hideyoshi's Vietnam or Spain. Hideyoshi's life parallel Napoleon in some way. But yeah, again, things have gotten mighty interesting. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, let's continue. See how far we get today. So, episode 43. Let's go. I am ready.
In the last episode, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's grand army landed on the shores of Kyushu in aims to not only save the Otomo clan from the Shimazu offensive, but more importantly, to subjugate the island as a whole and bring it entirely into Hideyoshi's sphere of influence. And after a hard-fought campaign, his armies would secure victory, and Kyushu would be brought into the fold. Now, with everything in the south and west in his grasp, Hideyoshi seeks to consolidate his power before turning his gaze east.
Fair enough. But again, from what we know, I mean, I guess, no, there's still some ways to gain, still some Rojo at this point, but they still don't feel like they're gonna be much of a threat. And then even further east, it's just a bunch of small clans, so it's really done, yeah. It's really done, no? Dreams of invading China and Korea. Hideyoshi inherited that dream. Really? Nobunaga too. It just feels like a terrible idea. I mean, it's like, you know, this country has been at war for 100 years. Once you've conquered the country, like, you should chill for like 50 years, wait for everything to really be consolidated and prosperous before doing anything like that. It's crazy to me that they want to do it right away after conquering the country. The Sengoku Jidai. The anti-war and the sword hunt.
By 1587, it was clearer now than ever before. The unification of Japan was at hand, and the Sengoku Jidai was nearing its finale. Total peace in the land was just barely out of reach. Truly, there were now none who could afford to stand against the full might of Hideyoshi and all of his allies and vassals.
Yeah, at this point, like, if a clan still decides to fight, it's suicide.
After the reining in of his own clan, which had brought about the assurance of his regime's future stability for a time, and the campaigns that won him dominance over Shikoku and Kyushu, the country was essentially his. The only obstacles that yet remained were in the east and to the north. with his most pressing challenge remaining being the family that had come to dominate the Kanto Plains for almost the entirety of the period, the mighty Hojo. Yet, before Hideyoshi was to begin his efforts in dealing with the Hojo, there were other matters on his agenda. Ever since its arrival into feudal Japan, Christianity was always a hot topic. While some fully embraced it, as well as the foreigners who brought it with them, others were still wary of its call. In reality, the addition of Christianity was mere fuel for the chaotic clashes between those who fell under its sway and those who wished to stifle its spread. And largely, we see the most drastic religious altercations taking place on none other than the island of Kyushu, where converted Christian clans such as the Otomo began a form of crusade against the Shinto Buddhist establishment in their domain, destroying temples, shrines, and casting monks and other holy men from their provinces, along with the forced conversion of those under them. All actions which went to disrupt the established order of the country, and were on full display for Hideyoshi as he made his way throughout Kyushu during his campaign in 1587.
I guess despite all the different sects of Buddhism and Shinto we've had so far, there hasn't been at least in what you talked about, there hasn't been massive war between the different sects, but just introduce Christianity and right away, boom, crusade. Great.
Hideyoshi was not as taken with the West as his predecessor Oda Nobunaga had been. Whereas Nobunaga tolerated Christianity as a means to an end, to solidify Western trade and technology that could help him dominate Japan, Hideyoshi was not nearly as convinced. Records indicate he was still courteous and kind to the foreigners in his country, yet what he saw in Kyushu would force him to take action against the type of behavior that Christian daimyos of Kyushu had been engaging in. In fact, it was even rumored that Hideyoshi looked upon the Christian fervor the same way that he saw the monks of Hongonji.
I was gonna say, he had so much trouble dealing with the Itoiki, was it? Which I don't know if they were really the Itoiki, they were a religious monk group, but from what they were portrayed as, they weren't really fighting for religion per se. It was more like they were fighting for almost as if they were a clan basically. So it was more for politics, is what I felt like. But he obviously saw how much of a problem religious, belief can be when you're fighting someone and they're so extreme about the religion. So yeah, I can imagine he's gonna crack down on Christianity.
Hideyoshi observed that the main Christian threat on the island was originating from the port city of Nagasaki, where an upper echelon of missionaries had been working to spread the gospel throughout the land, in return for aid from the West. These were his true enemies, not the daimyo who had been swayed by them. He had no qualms with the Otomo and other loyal Christian daimyo, simply the source of the Christian influence in Japan. By tearing out the roots, he believed he could stem the future tide of religious violence throughout the country. By midsummer of 1587, Hideyoshi issued the first Christian expulsion edict, ordering that all foreign Christian elements leave the country with the utmost haste. However, his order was not entirely enforced. Many who converted remained as such, and trade obviously was allowed to continue. Instead, we can see that this order more so acted as a hard warning against further Christian violence and disruption. As in the years to come, religious tension appears to quiet down. His order against the Christians would of course not be the last drastic edict he would give. More were soon to come, and perhaps the most famous of all would occur just 1 year later in 1588. The Sengoku Jidai, Japan's age of warring states, is iconic for a multitude of reasons, most of which obviously relating to the chaotic, violent nature of the period. And it is important to remember that it was not just the samurai and samurai clans engaging in conflicts, but also monks from militant monastic orders, and in many cases, peasantry upon civil unrest and revolt. Hideyoshi had seen much of this strife throughout his life, and once again he would bear witness to yet another uprising in the province of Higo shortly after the end of his conquest of Kyushu.
Well, that was fast.
In the last episode, I stated that after Hideyoshi secured Kyushu, Higo passed into the ownership of Kato Kiyomasa and Konishi Yukinaga. This is true, but I neglected to mention that Higo originally had been placed in the hands of another Toyotomi lord first.
Oh.
Sasa Narimasa, a name we have heard before, as he had been a long-running veteran of the Oda clan, yet shortly after Nobunaga's death, he would switch sides to join Ieyasu and take up arms against Hideyoshi during the Komaki Nakakute conflict. Yet in the aftermath, he once again found himself in service to the central regime, and after the fall of Kyushu, he would be given lordship of Higo. Briefly, Narimasa, it appears, was extremely unpopular with the people of Higo, and thus, shortly after he began his governorship, a massive revolt sprung up, one that culminated in the 1587 siege of Tanaka.
Why is this one popular, like, so fast?
By this point, Hideyoshi had had enough. Narimasa was stripped of Higo and later ordered to commit seppuku. This is where the province really was handed over to Kiyomasa and Yukinaga. Nevertheless, the more important takeaway I am trying to stress here was the mounting tension between classes and the easy ability for those under the samurai to rise up and rebel. Hideyoshi had taken note of this, and now the top matter on his to-do list became how to deal with conflicts arising from class divide, how to keep those below the samurai in check. In 1588, we have an answer. One of Hideyoshi's most famous yet controversial political edicts. He would come to the decision to ban all weaponry from certain members of the lower classes, particularly farmers and others who were seen as the most troublesome elements. Today, we remember this edict as the sword hunt, but it is again important to highlight that it was not just a massive confiscation of swords, but rather any and all weaponry the lower classes possessed.
Even my kitchen knife. Even my kitchen knife. Don't take my kitchen knife, please, Mr. Hideyoshi. I need to cut my vegetable, please. Konbawa. Hello, Mark also. Konbawa. Imjinwa, yes. I think we're here today.
All provinces under the influence of the Toyotomi began an extensive campaign to seize swords, daggers, spears, bows, arrows, and any firearms that had made their way into peasant communities. This would work to nullify any chances of insurrection in the future. Of course, this decision did not face criticism and anger from those who were being affected by it. Yet by this point, little could be done to stop the will of Hideyoshi, as thousands of weapons began pouring in. Yet he did try to smooth things over to a degree, making it known that the weapons were not simply being seized for the sake of demilitarizing the lower classes, but instead that the blades from these weapons were in fact going to be melted down and used to construct a great statue of the Buddha. An action he hoped would be seen as...
That's a crazy concept, huh? Like, melted weapon made to kill people, used to make a peaceful Buddha statue. Interesting. Kiyomasa slaying a tiger. Whoa.
As a noble endeavor. However, as Hideyoshi continued to press his own future political goals for the nation within the territories he held influence over, there was still obviously the fact that he had yet to fully secure the entire country. And in 1588, talks were beginning to commence between himself and the Hojo. Being one of the most iconic clans of the era, the later Hojo, as they are often referred to, have continued to be a staple power in the East, as we have come to see throughout this series. Ever since the revival of the Hojo name under Ujitsuna, their family had continued to secure new territory and contend with other mighty families in the region, from the Imagawa to the Takeda to the Uesugi to now finally the Tokugawa. Their path had been one of fortitude. In recent years, it aims to secure stability over their domains. In the wake of the fall of the Takeda and Oda Nobunaga's sudden death at Honnoji in 1582, Daimyo Hojo Ujimasa and Tokugawa Ieyasu had forged an alliance.
Yeah.
One that, under pressure, would soon face tremendous strain from the overwhelming influence of the growing Toyotomi threat to the west. In 1584, Ieyasu and Hideyoshi fought their legendary clash at Komaki and Nagakute, a bout that served to bring the Tokugawa into closer ties with the Toyotomi. And 1 year later, there would be the famous Toyotomi intervention during the first siege of Ueda that saw the Tokugawa and Hojo both fail to secure
Sanada.
territory from the obstinate Sanada clan. This brought about a new souring of relations between the Hojo and Toyotomi. To Ujimasa, it was becoming clearer and clearer that Japan would inevitably come to be dominated by the unquestionable might of Hideyoshi.
I mean, at this point, yeah, they have half of Japan. It is true, I didn't really see it like that, thinking about it through the series. But the Hojo actually really survived the longest, yeah, I mean. The Uesugi lost most of their territory, the Takeda were wiped out. Yeah, the Hojo really survived a lot longer. I guess it helps to be so much east, but yeah, they really survived a long time. The family crest is Tristone Entertainment.
In 1586, Tokugawa Ieyasu
Not familiar.
formally traveled to Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi's power base, and pledged full loyalty to him. Although there was still a tremendous amount of distrust between both Ieyasu and Hideyoshi, this formal bond between their factions may be looked upon as a sealing of fate for the country. Obviously, this move was one that placed the Hojo in an interesting position, with their strongest ally now also in league with their largest enemy. What was Ujimasa to do? In 1585, he had watched as Toyotomi forces swept over Shikoku and forced the Chosokabe into submission. And 2 years later, he looked on in displeasure as Kyushu was conquered. In the end, the Hojo remained the final major regional power independent from Hideyoshi's influence. Of course, as always, if Hideyoshi could bring the Hojo under his sphere of influence without war, he would surely wish to do so, as he always used diplomacy before
But the Hojo needs to give him an excuse to do it.
aggression. Twice, Hideyoshi would request the presence of Hojo Ujimasa in the capital, in a bid to have him swear fealty to the Toyotomi. It was an option Ujimasa continued to mull over. He knew bowing before Hideyoshi would save him and his family, along with preserving their long and prestigious legacy his forefathers had established. But to lose his own clan's autonomy was something he also had trouble coming to terms with. Long had the Hojo been safe, guarded behind the Hakone Mountains, a terrain feature that Ujimasa wished to utilize had he ever gone to war against previously the Oda and more recently the Toyotomi. Besides that, the Hojo were mighty, one of the strongest powers in the entire country. In terms of Hideyoshi's enemies, they were one of the most well-off, not lacking in technology and military structure like the Chosokabe, or spread thin like the Shimazu. In fact, after witnessing how the Chosokabe and Shimazu had been treated after their defeat to Hideyoshi, Ujimasa may have felt even more comfortable in defiance, knowing that their clans were still allowed to survive, even with their territory reduced.
I mean, I get that. It is true, yeah. On one side, Hideyoshi being kind of lenient with, the Shosogabe or, Kyushu is maybe not a bad way to try to bring some of the other clan under him by being like, I am not cruel. If you surrender to me, it's all good. But it also gives them the idea that, they can try to fight, which is not the best.
Ujimasa was pensive, ignoring Hideyoshi's calls and instead sending his brother to the capital, a decision that meant nothing, being that Hideyoshi wanted the appearance of Ujimasa himself. It is said that even Tokugawa Ieyasu, Ujimasa's current friend and ally, continually pleaded with Ujimasa to simply give in to Hideyoshi and avoid a disastrous conflict. Nevertheless, things began to simply fall apart. Hideyoshi could not secure the loyalty of the Hojo, as Ujimasa in the end remained prideful and resilient. War it would be. So,
That's a shame. Like, he should know he has no chance, right? So it's a matter of honor, you know? Just at least trying to fight, but it's really doomed at this point, right? It's really doomed, no? Okay, well, let's see how quick the Hojo submit in the war with the next episode. Let's see it.
as it
Sengoku Jidai, the siege of Odawara.
by 1589, Hojo Ujimasa, patriarch of the Hojo clan, was on the precipice of a new war against the mightiest power in the entire country, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Twice over the last few years, Hideyoshi had attempted to diplomatically win over Ujimasa, continually inviting him to the capital in aims to bring him under the
looks really
Toyotomi
nice
sphere
in
of
the sound.
influence. And as we saw in the previous episode, it did not work. Ujimasa, with nothing else now but pride for the legacy of his family governing his decisions, stood defiant in the face of his own destruction. To this end, even his strongest ally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, had tried his hand at convincing the Hojo to stand down, rather than be forced by Hideyoshi to join an unfortunate war. Yet, it would all be in vain. The war was to happen now. That was certain. There would be no way around it. For Hideyoshi, he would view the conflict as his final campaign that would deliver unto him the last victory he needed in order to at last unify the country. As after the fall of Kanto, the lesser northern lords of the Tohoku region would be sure to fall in line and accept Toyotomi dominance over the...
Are we sure about that though? Like, some episodes ago we talked about Date Masamune, right? You know, rising and potentially taking a lot of Northern Honshu or something, but so far it looks like it hasn't really happened. So, yeah, I wonder what he's gonna do.
the land. The unfortunate reality of this final clash was that we can see plainly how easily it could have been avoided. Had Ujimasa simply given in and answered Hideyoshi's call, rather than standing resolute against an overwhelming enemy. In fact, it would be the Hojo themselves who can be viewed as the actual instigators of the entire war, when in late 1589, Hojo forces struck out against the Sanada clan in Kotsuke province in retaliation for what they saw as unfair treatment by the Toyotomi following the redrawing of borders in the aftermath of the 1585 siege of Ueda. Being that the Sanada were a vassal family to the Toyotomi, Hideyoshi now once again possessed the excuse he needed to justify a war against Ujimasa.
Every time people give him an excuse, like, it's really luck. Hideyoshi has a lot of luck.
By the third month of 1590, Hideyoshi began his final campaign, setting out from Kyoto at the head of a massive army. Ahead of him marched a combined Oda and Tokugawa force who would travel along the Tokaido, while to the north, armies under Maeda Toshie and Uesugi Kagekatsu would pour down into the plain.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. I must have forgotten in the last episode, so the Uesugi have already swore loyalty to Hideyoshi. I thought they were still, like, independent, but no. I guess not. I guess not.
By sea, additional forces including Chosokabe Motochika would arrive to link
Hojo's clan Odawara Castle was Sogamase, meaning they surrounded the town and field within the castle ground, allowing them to fight indefinitely. Interesting.
up through the province of Suruga. Collectively, it is estimated that Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his allies fielded around 200,000 against the Hojo.
200,000.
Previously, the Hojo had relied heavily on the natural terrain of the Kanto region, specifically the Hakone Mountains as a natural defensive barrier. The sheer might and vastness of the attacking force closing in all around them meant that they would not be able to properly use the terrain as much to their advantage. This became evident as border castles under Hojo Ujiteru and Ujikuni inevitably became overrun. Hojo Ujinao, Ujimasa's son and the current daimyo of the clan, is said to have wished to still do battle in the field, albeit only commanding an army that was perhaps roughly a quarter of the size of the Toyotomi. In the end, thanks to counsel from his father Ujimasa and other senior Hojo retainers, he was convinced to instead hold up within their citadel at Odawara. In fact, the Hojo would end up calling almost all
Wait, hasn't Odawara already been attacked in another video we saw once, I think?
Of their forces into Odawara, emptying the Kanto plains and essentially leaving all of their territory free for the Toyotomi armies to march in and claim.
Okay.
But there was some sound logic behind this decision, however. Odawara was seen to be one of the mightiest castles of its time, a massive fortress and capital to the Hojo clan, with an estimated 82,000 Hojo soldiers positioned and entrenched there to defend the Hojo power base. Hideyoshi was in for one hell of a siege. On top of that, this had also been a strategy that had succeeded before, specifically when Odawara was besieged by Uesugi Kenshin in 1561, shortly
Okay, so I was right, yeah, there was a battle here
before the climactic fourth battle of Kawanakajima. If the Hojo were to survive, it would be by withstanding the siege to come. Yet, there was one thing Ujimasa overlooked.
It's like, how do you survive the siege? You have no allies to come to help you, you know what I mean? Like, there's actually no one to come save you. Everybody is on Hideyoshi's side.
Hideyoshi was perhaps the greatest siege expert Japan had ever known.
Yeah.
If the Hojo were to sit and wait inside of their castle, Hideyoshi would wait outside. Although simply sitting would eventually cause restlessness. No, this siege had to be different. The answer was to turn the Toyotomi siege camp into the most unorthodox siege camp samurai warfare had ever seen, transforming his position into a makeshift city of entertainment, a carnival of amusement for his army. Women, entertainers, merchants, musicians, and dancers flooded into what can be remembered as one of the greatest parties in all of Japanese history. It was said that people all throughout the region, and even those from far into the north, began making their way to Hideyoshi's siege camp to join the festivities. This all went to ensure that the Toyotomi army surrounding Odawara would not be deterred. The castle would fall, no matter how long Hideyoshi had to wait. And on top of this, the Hojo soldiers
it kills them all of the soldier inside. I mean, I'm inside with like 80,000 other guys, and I'm looking outside, and the enemy army is like 200,000, and they're having fun. Yeah, that kills your morale.
The side of Odawara would continually be demoralized by all of the commotion outside. In fact, Hideyoshi would also, during this time, come to be visited by several daimyo from far in the north. Date Masamune, fresh off of his victorious campaigns against the Soma and Ashina clans, had been informed of the situation to the south. And after sending more spies to help determine who was winning the conflict, he came to understand that the obvious victor would be Hideyoshi.
Yeah.
This would lead to a hard decision for Masamune. For years, he had been steadily growing his influence in the north, feeding his ambitious nature. Yet now, with the Toyotomi literally knocking on the door to the north, Masamune needed to decide what would be his ultimate fate. Standing against Hideyoshi no doubt was deemed as a futile endeavor, as so many had tried before, only to be crushed. Instead, Masamune would come to the realization that he had no other choice than to fall under Hideyoshi's sphere of influence.
What the Hojo should have done?
To this end, by the 6th month of 1590, Masamune made his way to Hideyoshi's siege camp and pledged full allegiance to the Toyotomi.
Very smart.
Hideyoshi saw this as good news. If more clans throughout the Tohoku region would only submit, he may not have to invest himself in another campaign of subjugation. Of course, the Date would not be the only northern clan to follow this course of action, as we can also in time see the Nanbu sign on with the Toyotomi as well. Eventually, Hideyoshi would send forth rules to any lords in the Tohoku region who wished to join his faction. Rules such as the sending of political hostages to Kyoto, changes to the collection and taxation of rice grown within the territories, and perhaps the most aggravating, the dismantling of all residential castles belonging to northern vassals.
Odamunaga lit up Azuchi Castle with torches at night, charged influential merchant an enchantment fee, and personally guided them like on Star Wars, making him the world's first mastermind of entertainment. Okay, I didn't know that.
This last rule would end up causing several minor uprisings throughout the region, all of which would end up being put down, with or without the help of the Toyotomi. Back in the Kanto Plains, however, Toyotomi armies continued to mop up any minor resistance and claim vast swaths of territory. And while most of this went incredibly smoothly, there is the interesting tale of the siege of Oshi. Understanding that one of his most trusted retainers, Ishida Mitsunari, still needed to make a name for himself as a commander, Hideyoshi had placed him at the head of an army to have him seize castles throughout the region. Unfortunately for Mitsunari, he would be deprived any proper recognition when he was completely stood up by the small defending garrison force at Oshi Castle, which would not formally fall until after the fall of Odawara. This went only to sour Mitsunari's reputation, something that we shall see would later come back to haunt him. This story is told rather well in the 2012 film The Floating Castle, which I have reviewed on this channel. If you want to learn more about this siege, I do recommend you go check out this review because it's actually a really fascinating story. But getting back to the siege of Odawara, the castle itself would finally see some action at the hands of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who after what is described as some immense boredom, finally took the initiative to attack. Using miners, Tokugawa forces would manage to blow up a sizable portion of the castle walls, leading to an intense clash as Ii Naomasa would lead the Tokugawa vanguard against the Hojo defenders. And although this was an intense struggle, and it did help in lowering the resolve of the Hojo, Ujimasa would not fully decide to surrender until some time later. Realizing that there was no way he could hope to withstand the might of the Toyotomi and their allies indefinitely, and with Odawara now suffering extensive physical damage, by the end of the 6th month of 1590, he would finally give up. After repeated attempts by Hideyoshi asking the Hojo to surrender, and even after enduring a barrage of fire from Toyotomi guns in the final days, the Hojo capitulated. Later, it was revealed that Ujimasa had actually desired to fight on, and that the push towards the actual surrender was led by his son, Ujinao.
So the son is smarter, I mean, I guess that's what it takes, yeah? An historical drama series where Ishida Mitsunari is the main character? I know about, I was interested in watching some like Japanese shows about different period of history, and I've learned about the Taiga drama. I might watch some one day. I know that the Taiga drama, they're like 50 episodes, I think, and they cover a lot of Japanese history, so maybe I should watch some of them.
1 week after the fall of the castle, Ujimasa, along with his brother Ujiteru, would commit seppuku by the order of Hideyoshi. His death poem would read, "Autumn wind of eve, blow away the clouds that mass, o'er the moon's pure light. And the mists that cloud our mind, do they sweep away as well? Now I am about to disappear, wondering how I should grasp it. From the emptiness I came, hence I shall return there." This was the last gasp of the mighty later Hojo, one of the greatest samurai clans of the Sengoku period. With their fall, Hideyoshi stood virtually unopposed. Daimyo Hojo Ujinao would be spared execution, being that he had married the second daughter of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Instead, he would be sent into exile at Mount Koya, where he would die a year later from illness. In the aftermath of the siege of Odawara, there would be yet another redrawing of borders. Tokugawa Ieyasu had long been distrusted by Hideyoshi ever since their fateful clash at Komaki and Nakakute in 1584. Yet when called to arms by Hideyoshi, Ieyasu did respond, and in fact led the charge against the Hojo. He had proven himself. Yet still, Hideyoshi was wary of the Tokugawa. Eventually, he would come to the decision to award the entirety of the former Hojo domain to Ieyasu in exchange for his old provinces. This would not only serve as a sufficient reward for their involvement in the campaign, but also go on to shift Ieyasu the farthest he could realistically be moved from the capital.
Yes, the subtitles are not coming on here. Sometimes YouTube doesn't have the option, so I can't put it on. It's just not here, sorry. Some videos don't have it. I don't know why.
Capital. The one unfortunate downside for Hideyoshi was that moving Ieyasu to the Kanto region made him far more wealthy than he had previously been. In fact, it has been said that this move made him even more rich than Hideyoshi himself. After
Okay.
all said and done, Ieyasu found the reward more than sufficient, as he would go on to establish his new power base at what was at the time a rather unremarkable town called Edo.
Edo.
As for the former Tokugawa territory, Hideyoshi would first offer it over to Oda Nobukatsu, who also played a considerable role in the siege. Yet, not wanting to be displaced from the ancestral homeland of his family, Nobukatsu actually refused. And believe it or not, this would go on to infuriate Hideyoshi, who would cast Nobukatsu out and exile him to Kotsuke province. Instead, the former Tokugawa land would be divided amongst a host of Toyotomi vassals. With the land situation out of the way, Hideyoshi was free to move up to Utsunomiya, where he would join with Date Masamune and other loyal northern lords in their campaign to pacify the north, a
It's almost
concentrated
finished.
effort which would come to an end by the 9th month of 1590. And so it was by the end of that year.
Wow.
Japan, which for over 100 years had been in a constant state of internal war, was finally brought to peace. Hideyoshi had done what his predecessor Oda Nobunaga had set out to do: unify the land. Yet to say that this chaotic age was over is far from the truth, as the Sengoku Jidai is far from finished. So, what can we learn?
Okay, which is interesting because I understand that next we attack Korea and maybe China, but in my mind I always thought the Sengoku Jidai was specifically about the civil war in Japan, so I'm surprised that it's counted as part of it. Because here it feels over, you know, like what we've watched over the five last stream feels like the full story of the Sengoku Jidai. I mean, the country is conquered, more or less pacified. I mean, you know, it feels like the end of the story, and yet it isn't. Okay, well, kind of amazing. All it took to get here, you know, from Nobunaga to Hideyoshi, yeah. It's been something. But let's continue. Next episode. Subtitles, yes. Onyaku, please. Here we go.
The last episode,
Under one
in
sword.
the year 1590, the later Hojo clan, who had dominated the Kanto plains for over half a century, were snuffed out by Toyotomi Hideyoshi at the siege of Odawara. Their fall meant the virtual collapse of any resistance going forward for Hideyoshi. The North, fractured and divided, would never unite to stand against him, as we have already seen in the previous episode when clans such as the Date and Nanbu had already pledged themselves to the Toyotomi cause. This meant that from all the way in the north to all the way down to the shores in the south, all bowed to one man, Toyotomi
Beautiful.
Hideyoshi. Victory was his, and Japan was at last unified. But what now? In a perfect world, the samurai might have settled down into their domains as Hideyoshi established a strong central government to ensure the stability of the nation for years to come. Peace would reign supreme. Yet that would be just a dream. By 1590, after Japan had been at war for over 100 years, peace was a lie. The one question that would have been at the forefront of Hideyoshi's mind was how could he keep this from ever happening again? How could he ensure Japan would never slip back into such a chaotic and disastrous period of
Oh, is that why he's going to attack another country? It's like, you know, to make people stop fighting each other, let's go fight someone else. Is that the logic of attacking Korea? That makes some sense, I guess. Lord Date Masamune sent an envoy to the Vatican. I didn't know that, no? Interesting. Was he one of the lords that converted to Christianity?
incessant war. Although there could have been many steps taken to slowly transition the country into a strong and stable nation, Hideyoshi opted for another path, an idea that had been given to him by none other than his predecessor, Oda Nobunaga.
Really?
Nobunaga had been just as ambitious a daimyo as any other daimyo of the age had been, However, the key difference that separated Nobunaga from the rest was that his countless victories through his strategic genius gave him an aura of invincibility. Perhaps Nobunaga even came to some wild conclusion that there was some divine reason behind his destiny. Whatever the case, at times he began speaking of his dream to one day invade the mainland and lay claim to China. Wishing to conquer such a vast portion of Asia has to be by far one of the most ambitious dreams that any world leader had ever sought, rivaling that of Napoleon, Alexander the Great, and Genghis Khan.
It seems insane because at best Japan can probably at this point get maybe, I don't know, like 300 to 500,000 soldiers, but China has like millions of soldiers. Like, that's crazy.
Fortunately, as we know, Nobunaga was betrayed and assassinated in 1582, paving the way for Hideyoshi to become his successor. This dream now rested with him, and although Hideyoshi
were Christian and some of them stayed behind, so there must be some of their blood remaining in Europe. That's cool.
Hideyoshi had great ambition himself. It becomes hard to truly understand just how much ambition he actually had for an invasion of the mainland. As we know, over time, throughout Hideyoshi's campaigns that unified the country, his ego did grow quite substantially, and there were many who would say that he would have no doubt dreamt of a mainland conquest. What it comes down to, however, is simply what weighed heavier on his mind as an actual reason for why he would invade. Would the reason be forced by his own genuine ambition, or perhaps a more practical reason? Whatever the case, this was not a...
I was thinking maybe also it's like, it did finish what Nobunaga started, and you could say that Nobunaga had already done the big part of the work, right? I mean, when Hideyoshi took over, the Oda central government was already strong enough to finish its conquest. I think, it would have finished the same. So maybe he felt like, conquering Japan was something that he finished for Nobunaga, but maybe he felt like conquering Korea and maybe China is something he could do for his own legacy or something. I'm just saying that. I don't know if that's what he was thinking, but I can imagine that, it's maybe something he could think.
Question Hideyoshi had to think of just yet. Right after the death of Nobunaga, at this point in time his first order of business was uniting Japan. At least until he finally came face to face with a growing dilemma. As great as he was and as powerful as his regime had become, there was a looming threat over his head regarding the future of his family. This is something that is directly intertwined with the future peace and stability of the nation following the unification of Japan. If the Toyotomi regime remained incredibly powerful and unquestioning, a long-lasting peace would be confirmed. The problem for Hideyoshi was that his clan appeared to have a troubled future.
Right.
Not until 1589 did Hideyoshi actually have a son born to him. Before this, the future of his family lay in adoptions he had made, bringing in prominent samurai from other families, often done for diplomatic reasons. For as we know, Hideyoshi won his wars and his battles through diplomacy almost more than actual conquest.
Yeah.
Yet, going back all the way to 1586, we can start to see Hideyoshi beginning to panic. Perhaps an invasion of the mainland could be justified for the survival of the Toyotomi name, not necessarily as simply a campaign for glory. It was in that...
What does it change? Because his name is already massive, I mean... Like, he is the one that finished conquering Japan, so... That's already like the biggest achievement compared to any other clan in Japan at this point, so... What is he worried about?
Very year that he began to get the ball rolling on this idea, as he ordered the further expansion of a navy, a vast fleet that he could use to carry his armies across the seas into new conflicts. And although around that time we can maybe say that this navy was meant for his war against the Shimazu of Kyushu, what happened a year later confirms exactly where Hideyoshi's mind was at. In 1587, a reconnaissance force of 26 ships were dispatched to the Korean peninsula, the logical place in which a general invasion of the mainland would commence. They returned with news of the Korean military strength and possible landing locations, all of which illustrated to Hideyoshi just how ill-prepared Korea was for an actual attack. But being the diplomat that he
Are you
was,
sure about that?
it was said that after this reconnaissance mission in 1587 that he may have even reached out to Korea in aims to see if they would let him have free passage to China, a request that they did not reply to. Either way, for a time he would just sit with this information. First things first, Hideyoshi still had to finish unifying Japan. The birth of his son Tsurumatsu in 1589 changed everything. With a legitimate line of succession secure, perhaps Hideyoshi need not invest Japan into a war with China and Korea. With a son, his line was secure and the Toyotomi could continue to reign indefinitely. His legacy and that of his family was safe. To this end, after Japan was unified, by the 8th month of 1591, Hideyoshi issued a new edict which aimed to further pacify the land and increase future stability over Japan's many provinces. This edict would be the freezing of social class order, a move which worked to ensure that no one in Japan could freely move between the life they were born into. As we know, up to this point, the Ashikaga, peasant foot soldiers, were able to, through service, advance their status to that of a samurai.
Yeah, so we're saying that, like, the guy who used to be an Ashigaru, started from the bottom, climbed all the way up, is now saying that no one else can do this. It's not a meritocracy anymore. Okay, I'm starting to be a bit mixed about Hideyoshi. That's kind of sad. Huh? Like, he himself rise from the bottom, but now he's saying no one else can do it.
Essentially graduating into nobility. Thus was the case for Hideyoshi himself, seeing as how he too was born into humble origins. And although this freezing of status was evident across all classes throughout feudal Japan, we can see mostly that it was aimed at just the inner workings of the samurai class. The Sengoku Jidai was known for all sorts of upstarts and betrayals, seizures of power which worked to continually upend the established order. In many cases we refer to this as Gekukujo, the lower toppling the higher. And it was this very...
Which I mentioned before for Mountain Blade 1, the mod based on Sengoku Jidai in Japan is called Gekukujo. And I played it like a very long time ago.
The action that gave birth to the Sengoku daimyo, lords who arose from lesser status to become powerful, ambitious figures. That needed to stop, and any possible way of doing so closed off. No more could a samurai rise above his rank and lord. All must be loyal to their family. All must be loyal to their daimyo, and each daimyo loyal to the Kanpaku, Hideyoshi himself. And of course, to further this, no more could peasants have delusions of grandeur either. There needed to be an established order that was carved into stone. This was...
I mean, on one side I kind of understand the idea, right? On one side, meritocracy is really cool. But obviously, you know, with the Sengoku Jidai, it really led to, like, the constant war, right? Because since people know that they can potentially rise in power, fame, and stature, well, they are more incentivized to actually, you know, go to war, do scheming, do battles and all that. So yeah, I guess I understand it. I don't like the concept of suddenly people, you know, cannot rise from their class or something anymore, but I understand the point. If he wants to pacify Japan, you can't let people have ambition like that anymore, yeah?
100% something that needed to happen in order to ensure that the chaos which had previously gripped Japan never returned with such a vengeance. This edict freezing social order would have been a fine first step on the road to forging a new, stable Japan at peace. Yet, unfortunately, a gradual transition into peace would never come. Sadly, in that very same year, Tsurumatsu, Hideyoshi's firstborn son, died in infancy. The future
I was gonna say I haven't heard his name.
of the Toyotomi family was once again called into question. However, things were obviously different now than they had been in the mid-1580s. Japan was at peace now, and
I'm always surprised, like, it's such a problem for some of those rulers to have kids. Don't they have, like, ton of mistress, concubine, and sometimes multiple wives or something? I mean, you know, if we talk about logistic, if you have sex with one of your wife every day, like in just 1 month, you know, it's 30 times. Isn't it like easy to have a lot of sons? I understand like some people are not very fertile, right? But I'm surprised it's such a problem. Like clearly he had one son, so like, I don't know. Is it really that hard to have a son in this time? I understand that like kids died a lot in childhood at this time because of, disease and stuff like that. But again, you're literally the ruler of the country, so like, I feel like it would be easy for him to have a lot of sons. No? I don't know.
Unified under the Toyotomi banner. But without an heir, how long was this peace to last after Hideyoshi's death? Was his clan to fall apart again and the wars resumed? What would it all have mattered? Perhaps he could turn the attention of Japan away from his family, thus ensuring their survival. Once again, his thoughts found their way to the mainland. Investing the many daimyo and samurai armies of Japan into a new war against China and Korea would have paved the way for stability at home, or so it was believed. With each daimyo's attention focused on the war throughout the main...
It's kind of a crazy idea, still. Like again, the country is coming out of 100 years of non-stop war. You know, it's not even like really at peace yet, it's not really stable yet, and you want to go to Korea and then China. I mean, I understand from what he explained why she was thinking like that, but it seems like a mistake, even if I didn't know what happens, that I would say it doesn't work.
Land and their armies away, there would have been most likely no way for anyone to challenge the authority of the Toyotomi back home in Japan. The central regime Hideyoshi had worked to build up would continue on indefinitely, especially with new territorial claims on the mainland that could be further rewarded to those who took part in the war, thus incentivizing loyalty to the Toyotomi. At this point in time, Hideyoshi was 54 years old, with his health finally showing signs of deteriorating after a long life filled with wars and campaigns. If he was to have any chance at saving his clan and ensuring Japan stays united, he would need to strike quickly. Now, it is important to ask just how realistic an ambition this was.
It doesn't seem like it to me, I mean. But maybe he really thought it was possible.
Was Japan actually strong enough to conquer both China and Korea? Well,
I mean, Korea maybe, but China, that seems impossible, right? No?
Yeah. The military strength of Japan by the time Hideyoshi unified the country in 1590 would have been supreme for many reasons. The country had just been in a conflict with itself for over 100 years. The only thing people knew was war. The samurai and the ashigaru were all military veterans who had seen countless battles and were at peak performance and discipline, with samurai generals having a lifetime of experience to call upon. There was an excess of military equipment as well, with thousands of spears, swords, and top-of-the-line firearms readily available for battle. Japan did not lack in terms of military advancements and technology whatsoever. Not to mention the millions of manpower that Japan could call upon to serve. All of this has led to many historians considering Japan by the end of the Sengoku Jidai to be the most powerful force militarily in all of Asia, while some others have even gone so far as to say at this point in time, Japan had the strongest military in the entire world. But looks can be deceiving. Although Japan appears to have one of the greatest militaries by the 1590s, the many samurai clans under Hideyoshi had yet to all fight together in unison, while many campaigns had been waged involving...
That's what I was thinking again, like, there's so much little things that would cause problem in going to fight another country. I mean, all of the soldiers are used to like the way Japan does it, right? So the type of castle in Japan, the type of terrain, the type of fighting strategies. It's a mountainous country. The type of castle is very different from like other countries' castle. I mean, yeah, like our Chinese castle, for example, very different from like Japan. Like Chinese castles have crazy high walls, and sometimes they're made in stones, right? Yeah. I mean, I guess it's probably like part of it is really that, at the time, information was lacking. So, like us with our modern view of things, we know how massive China was and the amount of people and stuff like that. But at the time, maybe, even if you send spies, you don't have a full view of what the country is like, so you might think that you have a chance. Yeah.
Involving many daimyo in the past, what would a new war look like now? What egos, ambitions, and rivalries would come out on a fresh field of battle? That had yet to be seen. A new war was on the horizon, that much was for sure. Not in Japan, but abroad. With the survival of his family and the future stability of the nation on the line, Hideyoshi's eyes were now focused entirely on the mainland.
Bad move. I mean, again, I keep saying bad move, but, the narrator himself said that historians agreed that they actually had a chance, more than a chance. To me, I still feel like it doesn't seem like it, right? Like Korea, sure, even though, again, I know what happens, that they lose mostly from sea battles. That was the biggest weakness. But, China still seems insane to me that they even considered trying that. And again, right after like 100 years of non-stop war, which sure means that everybody is experienced, but wouldn't the country be insanely exhausted from it? I mean, 100 years of wars and, like people dying and plagues and, I don't know. Like, maybe I'm sticking too much in video game terms or something, but, it sounds like you need to wait like some turns in your game to like recover the economy, recover everything before doing it. Yeah, but I guess my view of things might be a bit off, yeah. But okay, let's learn about the Imjin War, which is damn a lot of episodes. I mean, I guess we don't need to watch all of them today. But let's start with the Imjin War. All I really know from the Imjin War, because I had watched the video before, is that, yeah, there's this admiral in Korea called Sunyi, I think, and he was really great, and he mostly beat the Japanese in naval battle, while the Japanese were great on land battle, which kind of makes sense, obviously, like, most of Japan's war experiences on land battle,
For a long time, people have been eagerly awaiting this series to reach this point in history, the outbreak of what would come to be known as the Imjin War, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of the Asian mainland via the Korean peninsula. A war that would come to be remembered as one of the most significant East Asian conflicts and the first of its kind in this early modern era, one that would have lasting effects that have continued to echo through time to this very day. Now, there are plenty of ways I could go about discussing the war, making it a longer excursion from the Sengoku Jidai series, or rather an entirely new series all on its own. Yet, as I stated in my most recent Q&A, at this point in time, I do not have an interest in doing such things. In the context of this series, I view the Imjin War as a larger element that was key in determining the outcome of Japan's Warring States period. Because of this, I have come to the decision that at this time I will do probably 3 videos on the topic of the war.
I think it was 5.
Largely focusing on the samurai and how the conflict would come to impact Japan going forward. Keep in mind, this is a samurai history YouTube channel, and although I could delve more deeply into the Chinese or Korean perspective, I wish to instead shed light on the war as part of the overall narrative of the Sengoku Jidai.
Fair enough.
That doesn't mean that I will not at a later date revisit the war in more detail, but as of now it will only be told within the context of the period and not to a greater extent. On top of that, this decision was also made with the fact in mind that there are already plenty of other channels and series here on YouTube that have done a fantastic job going in depth throughout the conflict. Channels like that of author Samuel Hawley, or Japan at War, have great content that focuses heavily on the Imjin War, as well as Kings and Generals, which has also made amazing videos covering the conflict. Please seek out those channels and
I guess eventually we might go back to this then, on this subject. I mean, as I said before, like right now we're still in the middle of the chronological order with this series of stream. But once we're finished, we'll go back to many different topics of different era of Japan. So might be something I go back to if I want more details, yeah.
content if what I do does not quench your thirst enough for the Imjin War. But with that said, let us now rejoin Toyotomi Hideyoshi as he plans his ultimate invasion.
Okay.
By late 1591, after pacifying the land, Hideyoshi had been set to bring Japan into a new era of peace and
Doesn't he start looking more like Nobunaga once he gets older? Like the same kind of facial hair?
stability, but it was one he could not guarantee would last. With the future of his family's authority in question and an uncertainty regarding whether or not after his death Japan may slide back into another period of civil war. Many over the years have attributed Hideyoshi's invasion of the mainland to be one born of his great ambition. And although he would have surely framed it that way, and it is one of the most logical conclusions one could make for why he would invade, in this series, as you may have already seen, I have come to the conclusion to instead adopt another theory that has begun to circulate. That Hideyoshi's conquest of the Asian mainland, although perhaps initially born of ambition, was yet instead carried out due to fear. Fear of losing everything he had worked so hard to earn. Fear that his family may be toppled if he did not turn the samurai to a new target.
Yeah.
As other historians have come to allude to, Hideyoshi's war in Korea was perhaps less about his own ambitions than we think, and much more about his own survival. As we saw in the previous episode, the plan to invade the mainland was not a foreign concept to Hideyoshi, as the idea of invading China had originally belonged to his predecessor, Oda Nobunaga, but had been passed down to him in...
By the way, from watching this series, I wanted to play some Samurai Warriors, but I've actually played the most recent one, Samurai Warriors 5, which is on Nobunaga. Actually, I streamed it on the channel like 4 years ago, on my old channel. It's a great game, I really enjoyed it, but it is the most recent Samurai Warriors, so I didn't really feel like going back to the older games, so I decided to play a modern Dynasty Warriors game, and I started playing Dynasty Warriors Origin, the latest one, where you play as like a new character called the Nameless, I guess, who kind of goes along all the big events of the Three Kingdoms, and so far it's a great game. I mean, I've tried many of the Dynasty Warriors games before, and the only one I played a lot of was 7, I think. But most of them I wouldn't play a long time, right? But yeah, so far I'm really enjoying Dynasty Warriors Origins. Not only is it the best looking Dynasty Warriors game I've played, but the gameplay is really fun. I'm almost at the part where you have to run from the booth, so kind of unrelated, but yeah. I'm definitely looking forward to Samurai Warriors 6. I think like, I really hope eventually like Samurai Warriors, they make a game where you take control of a clan, and you can kind of like try to conquer Japan yourself, I think that would be cool, yeah. Like a Total War game, Total War Shogun, but Samurai Warriors. Oh, welcome back, Mark Elf. Hideyoshi's biggest mistake is that he allowed Ieyasu not to join the war in Korea. I mean, I guess we're gonna learn about it, but yeah. I know that Ieyasu eventually becomes the next Shogun, but I don't know how. So I guess we're gonna learn about that.
The years following Nobunaga's death. And although for some time this idea may have been far-fetched, now it appeared more and more like the most rational course of action, turning the attention of the daimyo and the samurai class as a whole away from Japan and onto a new conquest. We even saw how over the years of his reign thus far, he had taken careful and calculated steps to prepare for a potential assault on Korea. Taking steps to not only build up the power of the Japanese Navy, but also perhaps court Korea as well. If Hideyoshi could secure an ally out of Korea, it could lead to an overall swifter invasion of China, his real target. We saw how in 1587, he may have first reached out to Korea asking for safe passage through the country and into China, to which they did not reply. Again, in 1590, after his unification of Japan, Korean envoys are said to have actually made their way to Jurakude to congratulate Hideyoshi on his accomplishment. It is here we once again see Hideyoshi deliver a message to the Korean king Sonjo. His message takes an ambitious tone, hot on the heels of pacifying the north.
Who had lost their lord and did not want to serve as a new one went to Malaysia or the Philippines. I didn't know that. Another interesting part of his story.
And unifying the land, his confidence at this point would have been high. His message reads, "My objective is to enter China, to to spread the customs of our people to the 400 or more provinces of that nation, and to establish there the government of our imperial city, even unto all ages. As your country has taken the lead and visited Japan, thus displaying difference, you need have no anxiety. On the day I enter China, I shall be leading my soldiers, and shall review my military headquarters. Then we shall renew our alliance. My wish is nothing other than that my name be known throughout the 3 countries. What is interesting to note here is that when he refers to the 3 countries, it has been said he was not referring to Japan, China, and Korea, but in actuality,
The 3 kingdoms? Really?
referring to Japan, China, and India.
Oh.
Once again, however, even with Hideyoshi's thinly veiled letter of intimidation and assurance, Korea disregarded it and gave no response. Thus, Hideyoshi tasked the Seoul clan of Tsushima with continuing to plead with Korea for safe passage. Korea would never humor the idea. In fact, many within the Korean government never even fully believed Hideyoshi would ever invade.
I mean, I wouldn't, you know. I know that Japan has been fighting each other for 100 years. I don't really expect them to attack me, yeah.
The entire concept just appeared too wild to comprehend, and even more so, probably believed Japan to be of little threat should they actually try an assault on the peninsula. We must keep in mind that the mainland opinion of Japan for many years had been that of piracy.
Everyone knows that Japanese samurai were strong, various factions vied for their help, resulting in Japanese mercenaries fighting amongst themselves, and factions that couldn't afford to hire samurai being defeated.
That the Japanese Wako pirates had continually raided China and Korea. They were unprepared for what Japan had become, following over 100 years of civil war that had hardened the island nation into a military powerhouse. After continually being ignored by Korea, by mid-1591, Hideyoshi realized he would not be able to count on them, and resumed plans to subjugate the country by force. This of course brings us back to the preparations he had been making. On the matter of the Japanese Navy, his grand fleet had grown substantially, yet it is important to recognize that much of it was not actually made up of newly built ships, but rather converted merchant vessels. When it came down to it, it appears the Japanese Navy was caught in an odd limbo. Japan had been exposed to superior Western-style warships and had tried to begin to implement design ideas from those ships into their own. Unfortunately, for their time, this came with some adverse effects. One large factor being the increased usage of iron nails, which easily rusted and weakened the integrity of the hull. There had also been another concept that had been typical to Japanese naval warfare that had never been thrown out. Instead of proper deck room for cannons, Japanese ships instead consisted of platforms for archers or gunners. This would greatly come to impact the range in which Japanese ships could engage at. On top of this, attempts to clamp down on Japan's rampant piracy problem led to a downfall of many with seafaring experience, leading to much of the actual sailors for his new navy having inadequate experience for the war ahead. In the end, it has been simply stated that although Hideyoshi saw the importance of possessing a large navy, he was woefully unprepared for a naval war of such magnitude.
Which again makes sense. I mean, I don't know if at this time it was known that Korea had a powerful navy. And I also would say that, yeah, the problem with Hideyoshi is that he's, you know, a master of war on land. Of course, he's not really great at sea, right? I mean, to make a comparison, the same thing with Napoleon, right? Like, you know, the French Navy was doing terrible at the time that he was around, yeah. Oh, Thailand, I see.
And did not fully grasp the importance it would come to play. Korea's navy, on the other hand, had become far more advanced after fighting Wako pirates continuously over the past decades. Many of their ships simply outclassed anything the Japanese could put forth, largely because they were armed with cannons, while the Japanese were not. But while at sea, Korea appeared intimidating. On land, the story was much different. In the previous video, we discussed how Japan by the year 1591 had become perhaps one of the strongest military powers in the entire world when it came to land warfare. A veteran force headed by elite samurai and matchlock armed foot soldiers equipped with some of the most advanced weaponry of the age, easily topping anything Korea or China could put forth in terms of ranged infantry. To make it worse, Korea at this point had really no standing army to speak of. Their military forces were made up instead of poorly equipped, unarmored, and outgunned peasant conscripts, and led by aristocrat generals with little to no military experience whatsoever. Indeed, what Japan lacked at sea was definitely made up for by their power on land. Following the breakdown of communication with Korea in 1591, Hideyoshi would gather his generals at Nagoya Castle in Hizen Province, not to be confused with the Nagoya Castle that would later be built in Owari. It would be here at Nagoya, a close position to Korea, where they would plan out their grand assault, and afterwards where Hideyoshi would continue to base his headquarters for the war. Being that Nagoya Castle in Hizen was located deep in western Japan, it was mostly western daimyo that were called forth. Figures such as Mori Teramoto, Chosokabe Motochika, Shimazu Yoshihiro, Nabeshima Naoshige,
all names that we know,
and Konishi Yukinaga were some of the most prominent figures among others. In total, throughout the war to come, Japan would field roughly 500,000 troops, mostly made up of ashigaru, but also including samurai heavy cavalry.
I guess I was really wrong earlier, thinking that, max they would have 500,000 troops. From what he said in the previous video, they could potentially have a few millions, so I was really not right about the numbers of troops.
But it is very important, however, to note the role of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Over the years, we have seen how Ieyasu had become what at this point can be considered the second greatest power in the entire country, and the largest rival to Hideyoshi himself.
The change of heart.
Yet in terms of the war to come, Ieyasu's Kanto domain was far from the west. Thus, Ieyasu was able to negotiate his way almost out of the war entirely. Because of this, the only role he would come to play throughout the conflict is that he would be forced to make the journey to Nagoya Castle and remain there with Hideyoshi, who no doubt carefully watched him. That old distrust between the two of them had hardly gone away. But even displaced, Ieyasu had loyal and capable supporters back home who would continue to consolidate and run his domain in his absence. In retrospect, it would have been far more advantageous if Hideyoshi had been able to demand some larger form of involvement from the Tokugawa, something that could have worked to drain Ieyasu of manpower or wealth in the long run, thereby weakening him from ever posing a threat in the years to come. Had such a demand even been possible is another question entirely. Whatever the case, by the spring of 1592, the invasion was said to be fully prepared. The initial plan would be carried out by 9 divisions, comprised of many prominent samurai generals and daimyo. The plan was to commence as follows. The 1st Division under the command of Konishi Yukinaga would be the first to make landfall in the south, seizing Busan and establishing a solid beachhead. He would then be joined by the 2nd Division under Kato Kiyomasa, who would begin pushing north. The final of the vanguard divisions would be the 3rd Division under Kuroda Nagamasa, who was to attack west of Busan across the Naktong River. Following this, they would then be joined by the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Divisions, while the 8th and 9th Divisions were to be used as immediate reserves and would be waiting on the islands of Tsushima and Iki. If all went according to plan, the overwhelming blitzkrieg of the Japanese army would drive up to seize Seoul and capitulate Korea in a short amount of time. On May the 23rd, Japanese forces of the 1st Division, who made their way from Kyushu up to the island of Tsushima, were now spotted off the coast of Korea. Chong Paul, the commander of Busan, was notified about the approaching Japanese fleet while he was out hunting. Immediately, he rushed back to the city and prepared the defenses. So Yoshitoshi of Tsushima would be the first Japanese commander to make landfall. He would issue one final ultimatum, demanding once again Japanese free passage through Korea to China. When they refused, Yoshitoshi began a siege of the city. The war had begun. This was the first time since the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 that massive samurai armies would clash with an outside enemy, and the first time they had done so not on Japanese soil. In the ensuing assault on the city, both Japanese and Korean accounts of the battle glorify devastating casualties on each opposing side. Yet, after the Korean commander Chong Paul was shot and killed, the city collapsed as Japanese forces pushed in. Meanwhile, Konishi Yukinaga had attacked the coastal fort of Tadejin, And after a vicious battle, Japanese forces took the fortification and butchered any survivors, in aims to show that resistance to Japanese occupation was futile.
As I always say with stuff like that, sometimes it backfires. Killing everybody just sometimes makes the next siege even harder because, if they know they're gonna get killed anyway, might as well fight harder and just not give up. That's what happens sometimes in war, you kill everybody to make a point of, don't resist, but it just makes people resist harder. It's really like, how do they get the message?
Not willing to allow Korean forces a chance to respond and form a defensive line, Konishi Yukinaga immediately pushed north to seize the fortress of Tongne. It is here he issued a new plea to stand down and allow Japanese free passage to China, which was once again heroically refused. This would result in yet another hard-fought Japanese victory, which was followed up by another brutal massacre of survivors. Following the capture of Tongne, the 2nd and 3rd Japanese divisions would make landfall in Korea. The beachhead had been established, and Korean resistance had been continually swept aside. With figures like Kato Kiyomasa, Nabeshima Naoshige, and Kuroda Nagamasa now all joining in the push north, things looked disastrous for Korea. All was going according to plan for Hideyoshi. So,
it's the classic of how does it go bad from there, I mean, again, from the bit I knew about the Imjin War, I know that the naval battle will be the problem, but they've already landed most of their troops, so how does it go wrong from here is what I'm thinking. I guess we're gonna find out. Yeah, I guess we're gonna find out. So next episode 2. And you know what? I was gonna say maybe we'll watch only 2 episodes today, but no. I kind of feel like watching the full Imjin War in one go, so let's watch all 5 episodes today. I want to know what happens in one go. I want the full story.
By the spring of 1592, the initial stages of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion was all progressing smoothly. After the first several clashes at Busan, Tadajin and Tongne, which saw the initial landing division under Konishi Yukinaga establish a solid beachhead, more forces were beginning to arrive. To give a brief refresher on the original plan for the invasion of Korea, Japanese forces largely under command of daimyo located throughout western
Man, I guess we can pass what we've already
Japan across the reserves, was largely believed by the Japanese to be the deciding factor in capitulating the Joseon government of Korea. But on top of that, the overwhelming presence of Japanese forces and incredible brutality being displayed by the samurai armies was also believed to be an important element to Korea's surrender as well, as it was their aim to break the will of the Korean people and simply force them to realize that resisting was simply a death sentence. In fact, it is this brutality right away that I want to address and focus on before going any further. Now, most accounts of samurai brutality during the Imjin War were obviously more recorded by the Koreans who witnessed it firsthand, and often their recounts of what they saw samurai armies doing is pretty extreme. Indiscriminate and senseless massacre of populations, butchering of men, women, and children. But it doesn't stop there.
Again, during the actual Sengoku Jidai, they were doing that within the country itself, right? So, of course, against an enemy in a different country, they weren't gonna use nicer tactics.
From mass beheadings of people, the Japanese soldiers also went after dogs and cats. As stated before, this awful brutality was condoned by samurai commanders. It wasn't just raiding and pillaging for loot and supplies, a normal facet of warfare. This was mass murder. The samurai believed it was completely necessary to break the will of the Koreans, forcing them to realize resistance was futile.
Didn't the Mongol do the same? The strategy was if the city surrenders to the Mongol, they're kind of good, but the second a city, resists, then they just kill everybody, basically. That was, different part of history, there's, strategies like this, which again, the point is supposedly to break the will of a country, but does it ever really work? I don't know. Kind of like with the Mongol, it never really worked overall, in the sense of like, maybe sure some cities later on didn't resist, but overall, it didn't really ever lead to a full country just giving up. So I don't know if this strategy ever really works.
This raises an interesting question, however, regarding did this sort of massacre take place regularly during the Sengoku Jidai back in Japan?
I thought so,
To
yeah.
put it simply, it did, but not necessarily to this scale. The brutality of the samurai throughout time is legendary. In many cases, they were very cruel people, who often exercised their authority over those beneath them. That wasn't always the case, as there are very noble examples of samurai as well, but plenty of them were not the stoic image we are so often led to believe they were. We have to remember, first and foremost, the samurai were a warrior class who dominated Japan and who ruled the land.
As I always say, like the country has been at war for 100 years. Everybody here has been born in the middle of constant war, since you're a kid. That's all you see. It always reminds me of like the Russian Revolution in World War One, and just Russia's involvement in World War One. And after that, there was a quote of it was something about like it's not exactly that quote, but it was saying, for all the atrocity that happens in Russia after World War One, all the purge, the inner fighting, the crazy starvation with the Holodomor, and it says something along the like of, what else could you expect from a countries of brutalized young men from like, the slaughter of World War One, right? Like these people, all they know is like the, extreme violence, and so that's just what continues, right? So it's the same here, 100 years of war. Everybody just knows war. It's really a shame, which is also why it's kind of crazy that from what I know, even though we haven't gone to that part yet, after the Sengoku Jidai is like a pretty long time of, peace in Japan, more or less. A very like opposite to the Sengoku Jidai. So it's really interesting.
Like any feudal society, their will had to be enforced. This is one of the reasons why previously organized efforts like the Ikowiki and other groups of militant monastic orders were seen as so dangerous to the samurai, as they posed a serious threat to upend the established order, crumbling the hierarchy of samurai dominance over the nation. Brutality was always enforced when necessary, and often no one ever stopped to question what was right and wrong. A prime example of this is Oda Nobunaga's brutal massacre that occurred on Mount Hiei, when he ordered not only the monks of Enrakuji destroyed and the temple burned to the ground, but also the mass slaughter of any civilians along the way. What is interesting is that we often hear more about the tragic loss of the historic temple complex and not the actual murder of thousands of people. Of course, in the years since this event, we have come to recognize it as the brutal act it was. But back during that time, it may have simply been routine. The real tragedy thought of at the time was probably just the loss of Enryakuji. Bringing this back into the context of Korea, however, the slaughter of Korean civilians was obviously viewed differently by both sides. While the samurai saw the slaughter as a necessary measure for victory in the war, the Koreans understandably were appalled and heartbroken by the atrocities being committed. As we will come to see, will actually go to have the reverse effect of what the Japanese would have desired. If any.
That's what I said. Like, I feel like most of the time, that's what happens. Again, massacre people as an example to not resist just makes people want to resist even more.
Their will to fight on grew as the conflict began to turn into a greater patriotic struggle for the survival of Korea. The problem as things stood now, however, for the Korean army was a general lack of organization, advanced equipment, discipline, and competent leadership. They were completely unable to stop the samurai no matter how bitterly they defended, as the vanguard Japanese divisions pushed forth nearly unchallenged. This caused much of the Korean army to either go into hiding in the countryside to work as a guerrilla force or fall back to regroup in a more determined defensive effort. By June 7th, roughly 2 weeks after the Japanese had first made landfall, Konishi Yukinaga had pushed up the furthest, seizing the fortress of Cheongju, one of the final obstacles between Japanese forces and the Korean capital. But he had advanced much further than what had been planned, perhaps not only due to the incredibly weak resistance he had faced, but more importantly, in attempts to gain some personal renown in the process.
Of course,
Because of this, when the 2nd and 3rd divisions finally linked together with him, Kato Kiyomasa and Kura Nagamasa both tore into Yukinaga for not following the plan, berating him for his reckless and glory-seeking behavior. But even then, this was only the continuation of a heated rivalry.
This, by the way, the thing around his neck is like a Western thing, right? Doesn't mean he's a Christian lord. I mean, I guess he was from Kyushu, so probably, yeah.
That had begun years before between Kiyomasa and Yukinaga. Both men had interesting relations to their overlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. While both were extremely loyal to him, Kiyomasa had been more of a central figure in many of Hideyoshi's campaigns, also being known as one of his 7 spears from the Battle of Shizukutake in 1583. Yukinaga, on the other hand, had joined Hideyoshi more recently and is widely remembered for being one of the few Christian daimyo, placing him in an odd position, being that Hideyoshi, as we know by this time, had become mostly anti-Christian after seeing what Christian influence had done to the daimyo and provinces of Kyushu. Following the subjugation of the island in 1587, Kiyomasa had been granted ownership over the northern half of Higo province, while Yukinaga had been given the southern portion. In time, their egos, close borders, split jurisdiction over the same province, and even Yukinaga's Christianity led to the brewing of this heated rivalry. Perhaps Hideyoshi did not realize to the extent at which these two men feuded, as now they were both in charge of 2 major vanguard divisions barreling north into Korea. From this point, the race to Seoul was on, as Yukinaga and Kiyomasa both advanced along separate...
I mean, I think at this point, to me at least, it's fair to say that Hideyoshi has lost the plot. And clearly, as was talked about earlier, maybe it was driven a bit by his fear of, like, you know, the family falling, but it's kind of lost the plot. I mean, you know, after he took over from Nobunaga, you know, he's shown that he was able to conquer the rest of Japan, not just by massacring people, right? He did use a lot of diplomacy, but this Korean invasion seems like it's losing a lot of what made sense before, right? I mean, he tried a bit of diplomacy, right? But now he's given up, and he's just sent his commander, and clearly they don't have orders to not do massacre and stuff like that, which I feel like, you know, he should have ordered them not to do massacres. I mean, that's kind of like he got some of the clan, right? Like the Shosokabe, for example, they resisted, he beat them, but then he, you know, kind of pardoned them, basically. But I guess he's not going with the invasion force. They said he set a castle in Shikoku, Kyushu, sorry. So, yeah, it's kind of lost the plot, and that's a shame, yeah.
routes to seize not only the capital, but further glory in doing so. Unfortunately for Kiyomasa, who took a shorter path, the Han River proved to completely halt his advance. While further down, Yukinaga was able to find a shallow stretch that allowed his forces to make the crossing. Yet, when his army finally reached Seoul, they found it to be completely abandoned. Korean forces had pulled out. No one stood to defend the capital. And the Korean king Sonjo was already fleeing far off to the north. The easy victory in the war they thought they would find with the capture of Seoul was now far out of reach. When Kiyomasa was at last able to make it past the river and arrive at the capital, he found the gate shut to him and had to argue with Yukinaga's soldiers just to gain entrance into the city.
Wow.
This no doubt poured more fuel onto the fire between them.
Are they gonna fight?
But while Japan was steamrolling the Korean forces on land,
What is that ship? Why does it have spike like it's a pufferfish or something? That's a crazy design. A pufferfish ship.
At sea, the story was about to change entirely. In the previous episode, we discussed the advancements the Korean Navy held over the Japanese. Yet even with advanced ships, still the sheer size of the Japanese fleet had gone so far as to intimidate two of Korea's top admirals, Bak Hong and Won Gyun, into scuttling a portion of their ships, burning their naval bases and fleeing from the area. Yet that same fear was not found in the soon-to-be famous Korean naval commander Yi Sun-shin.
Yi Sun-shin, okay. I had the name wrong, I guess. Yeah. I just know it's legendary, and I guess he was a great naval tactician, basically. He's kind of like, I think the two most famous naval commander in history is Nelson and Yi Sun-shin.
The methods and mindset of Yi Sun-shin had come about at the perfect time. He did not follow the traditional style of Asian naval warfare that had previously heavily relied upon warships being used as more like platforms for melee combat, and instead viewed the new face of naval warfare as one dominated by ranged engagements. On June 16th, Admiral Yi Sun-shin had been ordered to link up with Won Gyun, who had previously fled and destroyed his own base. Linking up with Won Gyun's remaining ships, they moved towards the sea lane between the south of Korea and Japan, which continued to flood supplies and reinforcements into the conflict. They would eventually be alerted to a large portion of the Japanese fleet under the command of Toro Takatora, who were docked at the port of Okpo, while Japanese soldiers and sailors from the ships were raiding the nearby area. Because the ships were mostly unmanned and troops preoccupied, Japanese forces were completely unaware as Yi Sun-shin's ships pulled up and began bombarding the Japanese Navy at range. It is important to remember that while Korean ships were at this point now armed with cannons, Japanese ships were not. Thus, the best the Japanese could do to return fire was to shoot matchlock firearms back at them, which did absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
By the end of the engagement, Japan had lost between 16 and 26 vessels, while the Korean Navy had not suffered a single casualty. Quickly.
I mean, yeah, like, maybe fire arrows, if they're kind of wooden, the Korean ship, but otherwise, yeah, like, you have nothing to fight back. That's kind of crazy. Except trying to, like, charge, I guess, and then board the ship. But, yeah, that's crazy. I wonder if Hideyoshi really didn't know about, like, gunships, basically.
It became clear that the war at sea was going to be an entirely different beast for the Japanese, not only in terms of the superior quality of the Korean ships, but also, as we will come to see, greater naval leadership. Yi Sun-shin would continue his campaigns against the Japanese throughout the remainder of 1592, scoring a multitude of victories in such battles as Sechon, Hansan Island, and later Busan, sinking scores of Japanese vessels.
It's really going fast over there, and I kind of wanted to know more about the battles. Really, I have to go back to that eventually. I should write it down. Actually, I just opened another tab. In general, I'm sure there's like more details about the battle somewhere.
Nearly crushing their naval efforts entirely and crippling the supply lines going from Japan to Korea. In time, it would become obvious Hideyoshi's Grand Navy had failed. Back on land, it had been decided that Yukinaga would rest his troops in Seoul, while Kiyomasa was to march up in aims to cross the Imjin River and continue north. However, the Korean army had now regrouped under General Kim Myong-won, who had established a defensive network along the opposite shore.
I like that guy with the demon face on his shield.
He had ordered his soldiers to burn the land to the south, depriving Kiyomasa from any means with which to craft rafts to get across. Initially faced with this dilemma, Kiyomasa sent new word to the Koreans, again asking for peace in exchange for passage into China. Still, they rejected. Because of this, Kiyomasa encamped upon the south bank for roughly a month. Finally, by July, he devised a clever scheme, pulling the majority of his army back, only leaving a small detachment along the shore. General Kim Myong-won perceived this as a retreat and ordered his forces to cross the river and strike at what he thought was the tail half of a withdrawing Japan.
Damn, the samoas are pretty cool with the red ponytail. I don't know what you would call this, but that looks pretty cool. I wonder if the samoa can stop a bullet. That looks very scared, so I feel like this could stop a bullet, no? Well, a bullet at a time.
Japanese army. Instead, Kiyomasa sprung his trap, ordering the remainder of his forces to pounce on the Korean army, who were now trapped on the wrong side of the river.
Well,
victorious, he was then able to seize the boats with which the Korean forces crossed and use them to ferry his own army to the north bank of the Imjin River. With this new beachhead established in the north, Yukinaga and Kiyomasa both set off on new campaigns. Yukinaga's new goal would be the city.
They've definitely passed the 38th parallel by now. They're into North Korea.
City of Pyongyang, in which he hoped to finally catch the fleeing King Sonjo. But for Kiyomasa, his new objective was something more ambitious, a spearhead far to the northeast into what was considered Korea's most wild territory. His eventual goal was to even cross the border into Manchuria. In an extremely short amount of time, the might of the Japanese war machine had pushed deep into Korea with little to no resistance from the Korean army, who tried desperately to stop the samurai onslaught. Back in Japan, news of military success throughout the peninsula was met with joy from Hideyoshi. Most of his fears must have begun to fade, aside from the fact that he was now very concerned about Japan's failures at sea and the implications it would have to the war on land. Still, with
I mean, yeah, that's pretty terrifying. Like, if you keep losing the sea battle, you won't be able to send more men and supplies, so your amazing army is going to be stranded. That's pretty terrifying.
Japanese armies nearing the northern border all expected him to soon make the journey to Korea himself, so that he may lead the initial march into China,
Right.
his true objective. From his current military seat of power in Nagoya Castle of Hizen, his attention was completely focused on the war, while his nephew Toyotomi Hidetsugu managed the affairs for the rest of the country. After the death of Hideyoshi's son and heir Tsurumatsu in the previous fall, Hideyoshi had eventually gone forth to name Hidetsugu his new heir. By January of 1592, Hideyoshi had resigned his position as the Kampaku, the imperial regent and effective head of the Japanese government, and appointed Hidetsugu to succeed him. From this
Fair
point
enough.
on, Hideyoshi would be known as the Taiko, the retired regent. Yet although he
We're
was
doing this
considered
again.
retired, he still largely remained the most powerful individual in all of Japan. The
So,
interesting
is the shogun and Taiko at the same time? Okay.
thing is that this may have not even been the final role Hideyoshi had envisioned for himself. With his real goal being China, and his genuine fear of his name and family eventually being toppled after his death, it has been largely suspected that one of his true aims was to claim the mandate of heaven from China, thereby becoming a new emperor himself over much of Asia, an act that would immortalize his name forever.
I
The
guess, yeah.
Mandate of Heaven is something you can learn all about in this great video by Cool History Bros, a channel you should all go check out and subscribe to if you haven't already. This
I don't really know the details, but yeah, it's like the Chinese view of, like nobility, I guess, the mandate of heaven, like nobility to rule the country, like the ultimate prize.
video dives deep into the concept while also briefly touching on Hideyoshi's potential intent to claim it. Links down below. But no doubt, by midsummer of 1592, with the invasion of Korea having gone so well so far, with the Korean army in utter disarray and samurai armies marching nearly uncontested northwards, Hideyoshi's mindset must have been fixated on the next step: China.
Yeah,
So,
but it's so
what did
big.
we learn so
It's so big. Seriously. It's so big. Alright. Good episode. Good episode. Okay. I'm gonna take a quick break before we watch the next 3 parts. Just give me 5 minutes. I am coming back. And then we finish the engine war for this time. Oh, wrong page. Okay, mec, sorry for the wait. So yeah, let's finish learning about the Imjin War part of all this. It is mighty interesting, that's for sure.
In the last of the
Here we go, subtitles.
of 1592, the vanguard Japanese division under Konishi Yukinaga
Maybe for the recap.
the endeavor as of the rafts and boats the Japanese were going to use to make the crossing. Thus, the samurai were now stalled once again in a similar way to how Kato Kiyomasa had been held up at the Imjin River. Unable to quickly find a way to cross, Japanese soldiers would briefly encamp upon the south bank. It appears, however, that the Korean army had not learned from their past failure when they commenced a night raid soon across the river to try to rout the Japanese force. And although the surprise assault did prove to be initially successful, eventually the overwhelming number of Japanese soldiers fell upon the Korean army and caused a frantic retreat back across the Taedong. It was here that samurai commanders observed the routes at which Korean forces fled, noting important points along the river that proved to be shallow enough to ford. With this discovery, Yukinaga and Nagamasa's army was soon back on the march, crossing over the river and charging towards Pyongyang. Once again, Korean forces were left with no choice other than to abandon the city and flee further into hiding. In their departure, they made sure to destroy much of the heavy weaponry that they could not bring with them, sinking their heavy cannons into nearby bodies of water. But while they were able to deprive Japan from seizing new artillery, they completely neglected to destroy stockpiles of food stores that were left within the city, only to be found by the Japanese as they entered Pyongyang.
Well,
But while in the west Pyongyang had fallen, in the east, Kato Kiyomasa, who was leading a significant vanguard division of his own, was driving his 20,000-man army onto what would become a famous expedition into the far north. This territory to the northeast was considered by most to be the wildest area of Korea, but it was one that needed to be seized to cover the eastern flank of Korea's border in preparation for the invasion into China. But even more importantly, specifically when it came to Kiyomasa, was the glory that could be won in such an ambitious campaign. Forcing his way east, Kiyomasa's army would begin seizing a number of Korean fortifications and seizing the provincial capital of Hamgyong province. Following this, he left behind a token force to garrison the area before leading the remainder of his men northward along the coast. While to the south, an army under the command of the famous Shimazu leader, Shimazu Yoshihiro, moved to secure the remaining countryside, taking a number of strongholds before eventually turning inward to establish himself at Wonju, the provincial capital of the central province of Gangwon. But while the south was being tied down, Kiyomasa pushed deeper north until finally his forces would be met with some difficulty when they were confronted in battle by Hamgyong's remaining provincial army. They would initially clash in open terrain that favored Korean cavalry tactics, bottling Kiyomasa's forces up and causing them to retreat to a nearby grain storehouse, where they took defensive position and managed to use their matchlocks to hold off wave after wave of Korean assault. After the Koreans eventually withdrew for the night, Kiyomasa quietly led his men out of the area of the grain storehouse and into positions around the Korean encampment, which was located in a swamp. Springing his ambush, Kiyomasa's soldiers gunned down the remainder of the Hamgyong army as their bodies sunk into the murky waters below.
oof.
Following this victory, Kiyomasa was able to finish the subjugation of the province using the same brutal tactics of subjugation that had made the Japanese occupation one of great cruelty thus far. But interestingly enough, there would also be a sizable portion of the local Koreans who would decide to defect to the Japanese, offering tribute and joining the occupation force in aims to save their lives and homes. Through them, he was handed over 2 of Korea's princes after the capture of Horyong, a Korean penal colony on the Tumen River. Important hostages that could be used for negotiations ahead. But now, Kiyomasa was reaching the furthest north he could possibly go while still being in Korea. Any further and he'd be crossing the border into the Jurchen lands of Manchuria. However, Kiyomasa was bolstered by the success he had found so far, and wishing to not only seize the renown of being the first Japanese general to
You're going too fast.
cross the border, but also wanting to set an example as a model dutiful samurai, he would ultimately choose to sally forth and cross into the unknown. With a sizable army at his back, built up of mostly Japanese soldiers but also many of the Korean defectors, Kiyomasa briefly left Korea behind and marched into Manchuria, the farthest any samurai leader would ever go during the entire conflict.
Oh.
Yet quickly, after crossing the border, he and his forces would be set upon by a defending Jurchen army. And after a hard-fought engagement, and realizing that the effort would be fruitless so far from Japanese territory, he would be forced to eventually call for a withdrawal back into the safety of occupied Korea. Nevertheless, Kiyomasa's accomplishments, ambition, and fury during his northern warpath have all been said to be the crowning achievement of his military career. In a matter of 3 months, the Japanese invasion of Korea had succeeded in nearly every facet except one. Korea, although mostly seized by Japan, still fought on land through bitter determination and guerrilla warfare, and at sea victoriously by superior skilled admirals such as Yi Sun-shin, who I talked much about in the previous video. It was this spirit to continue the fight that would in the end be probably the most deciding factor in the reckoning that was to come for Japan. Had Korea capitulated now or earlier, samurai armies under the command of Toyotomi Hideyoshi would be pressing directly into China. Although with the current state of affairs, with Korea still fighting in a desperate war all across the peninsula, the Japanese could not hope to simply move on yet. On top of that, the situation at sea was becoming more and more.
Look at this thing. Man, the square and ship design were insane. Like, I guess the point of the spike on top is, for like a boarding, right? I mean, someone trying to board is gonna spike themselves. But what a design.
Or apparent. It was clear to almost all Japanese commanders now that the Korean Navy held the upper hand, and there was little Japan could do other than resort to defensive tactics in aims to preserve their ships. But the largest consequence for the Japanese situation at sea would be the raided supply lines between Japan and Korea. If Japan was to succeed on land, they required a fresh stream of supplies and reinforcements to help hold down the lands they had occupied and continue their conquests. Although, as things stood now, the supply lines were becoming severely strained, and many samurai leaders in Korea began to fear for the shortages that were arising. There was also the imminent threat of China. Having neared the Chinese border, there was the potential threat that China may feel threatened enough by the Japanese to cross over and aid Joseon Korea. Luckily, up until this point, China had not been able to respond, facing internal problems of their own, tying up their military and preventing them from sending much-needed aid to their Korean allies. And even then, with the speed at which Japan was able to push up into Korea, Chinese leaders were caught off guard, not ever suspecting Japan to be so powerful. Many, in fact, began to believe that much of Korea had simply defected to join Japan, rather than believe that the Japanese military was truly so strong. Finally, by August, China was able to send a small bit of aid to Korea in the form of a 3,000-man army. Marching south to Pyongyang, they initially found the city to be deserted. The appearance of the Chinese army had caught Yukinaga's forces by surprise, and thus many of them quickly ducked into hiding while the Chinese were allowed to enter beyond the walls. However, once the Chinese army moved deep enough into the city, Yukinaga sprung the trap and ordered his forces to come out of hiding, ambushing the enemy and destroying them. But this was not seen as an auspicious victory. Instead, it was viewed as an impending storm, as Japanese commanders began to realize that China was at last entering into the conflict. There was no looking down upon China by the Japanese, as many samurai commanders are said to have held a solid respect for Chinese commanders and fully appreciated the size and scale of the Chinese military force. If Korea had fallen and the Japanese supply lines...
From what we've seen in this series from the beginning, right? Like, when Japan was still, a fairly like, low, not really military country, and they had relation and embassy to Japan back in the era, even before that, right? I mean, Japan really knew the scale of China. So, it's fair to be respectful.
Perhaps then Japan could have been able to take on the mighty beast that was Ming China. But now, with a war still raging across the Korean peninsula, and a lack of incoming supplies and reinforcements, the situation looked bleak. In January of 1593, China finally was able to move with full force into Korea in aims to push the Japanese back into the sea.
Oh boy.
The Chinese expeditionary force into Korea was under the command of a capable leader named Li Rusong. The Chinese army had initially set out with 43,000 troops, but were now bolstered by an additional 10,000 Koreans and an extra 5,000 Korean warrior monks. There are also some records that state the appearance of an additional 40,000 Jurchen troops present as well, but those appear to be largely unconfirmed. By February, Chinese and Korean forces were now drawing back up to Pyongyang. Konishi Yukinaga, at the head of only 15,000 troops, was fully aware of the unfavorable position he was in, and quickly sent out forward detachments to harass the advancing army. Yet, failing to halt them, eventually, once they had reached Pyongyang, Yukinaga would send word to the Chinese and Korean armies that he wished to open negotiations with them. They would refuse, and thus Yukinaga would in turn order another night raid of the enemy army, in hopes to break them before they even began a general siege of the city. Li Rusong, however, had anticipated such a move, and through the use of his forward scouts was able to flush out the Japanese raiding force, using arrow volleys to push them back. Before the inevitable assault of the city began, there would be a failed attempt by the Chinese and Koreans to assassinate Yukinaga by baiting him in with the actual prospect of conducting peace talks. Unfortunately, their plans were foiled. Following this, the Great Siege of Pyongyang began. If there is one thing the Chinese held over the Japanese other than numbers, it was superior artillery, as hundreds of Chinese cannons roared, crumbling walls and buildings.
They did invent gunpowder, so, you know, of course they're good at it.
All throughout the city. Soon, Chinese and Korean troops began flooding in, as Tippo-wielding Ashigaru rained endless volleys down upon the assaulting soldiers. The orders given to the attacking troops were simple. No mercy was to be shown to the Japanese. All soldiers within the city or caught fleeing were to be cut down, other than Japanese commanders, who were, with any luck, to be taken alive. Yet still, the Japanese for a time held firm against the infinite waves of Chinese and Korean soldiers. It is even said that so many died trying to get over the walls that their bodies piled up into mountains of dead men that almost created a ramp with which more attackers could climb up. Eventually, the Chinese and Koreans would finally, through sheer force of numbers, begin to break through. Thus, bitter fighting through the streets of the city began until at last Yukinaga called for a full retreat. With winter having set in, his troops were able to make a desperate withdrawal across the now frozen Taedong River. The winter, of course, would have other severe side effects, as many of the retreating Japanese soldiers began to suffer from frostbite and fatigue. It was even said that many who were already wounded or dying from the cold were simply left behind. It was a sad march for Yukinaga's forces as he moved back to enter into the safety of Pongsan, a strategic position on the way to Seoul. Unfortunately, Otomo Yoshimune of the 3rd Division, who was supposed to be garrisoned at Pongsan, panicked when he heard of the incoming Chinese offensive. Believing that Yukinaga was likely killed and his forces crushed, Yoshimune opted to burn Pongsan to the ground and retreat to Seoul. Thus, when Yukinaga and the...
That's the problem with the communication at the time, right? The lack of... Sorry about the cat. The lack of fast communication between armies and commanders is like such a detrimental but fascinating part of history at this point.
The remainder of his beleaguered troops entered Pongsan. They sadly found nothing there with which to use for supplies or with which to take shelter from the cold. Instead, their march was forced to continue further south. This action by Otomo Yoshimune is largely one that has been continually judged as sheer cowardice, bringing great shame upon him and disgracing the name of the Otomo family.
I mean, I don't see it as cowardice, I see it as, again, lack of information. It was maybe not the smartest move, but, if he was right and that the other guy's army was completely decimated, yeah, like retreating was probably smarter than being under siege. From an army that just decimated the other guy, it makes some sense.
For the rest of its existence. But on the reverse side, things would not go entirely smooth for the Chinese and Korean reclamation campaign either, although they were able to win a great victory against the Japanese at Hangzhou, holding off waves of Japanese forces.
Man, they've got I think they call the Wacha, right? That shoot a massive amount of fire arrows. This thing looks crazy. I still can't believe that this is actual technology of this time. It looks so crazy.
Forces led by significant samurai commanders such as Ukita Hideye, Ishida Mitsunari, and Kobayakawa Takakage. Chinese and Korean forces would...
The initial invasion was successful because Korea's best troops were in the north defending against the Jurchen. Wait, so the Jurchen are not Chinese? I thought the Jurchen was like just Manchuria Chinese army, while the south was defended by inexperienced troops. Maybe, yeah. Maybe.
Also suffer a decisive defeat to the Japanese at the Battle of Pyeokjaegwan, which is often regarded to be one of the largest land engagements of the entire war. It was here Li Rusong, overconfident, charged hastily into a battle against a numerically superior Japanese detachment that was acting as a rearguard. The larger number of the Japanese managed to completely overwhelm the Chinese army and even nearly succeed in killing Li Rusong himself. Following this battle, it is said that Li Rusong no longer underestimated the Japanese, and had come to fully appreciate the prowess of Japanese superior matchlock gunners and skilled samurai warriors who all worked together.
Oh, they're foreigners. Okay. I didn't understand that. Interesting.
Together to completely shatter the mighty Chinese cavalry. From this point on, the Chinese army began to adopt a more careful approach to their campaign, not wishing to suffer another defeat like at Pyeokjaegwan. Finally, after a steady advance of the main Chinese army, Seoul would be threatened. Konishi Yukinaga still wished to enter into negotiations with the Chinese and Koreans, and he was not alone in this mindset. Several other battle-weary samurai leaders also shared in the opinion that the Japanese position was a hopeless one and peace talks needed to commence. One such figure that supported the idea of negotiations was Ishida Mitsunari, a samurai leader who was not remembered for being a skilled general or warrior, but rather an administrator and favorite of Hideyoshi, who now found himself on the front lines of the war in Korea. These commanders wishing to sue for peace were quickly met with pushback from other samurai figures who would not dare give up, and wished to continue to fight on, perhaps even until death. Paramount of these more hawkish figures was none other than Kato Kiyomasa, a samurai who was known to have almost an aura of militarism. Eventually, after the food stores of Seoul were raided and destroyed, the Japanese were once again given no other option than to abandon the city and fall back. Korea had retaken its capital. Following this, being forced further back south, a little...
Again, I'm learning a lot. I mean, in my limited understanding of the conflict, it was only at sea was Japan losing, and it's the main reason they eventually give up. But clearly that's not the case. They were also having quite a lot of defeats on land. So another part that I'm learning about. Very interesting.
Over a year since the war had begun, Japan would win one of their final victories of the first invasion, when they finally were able to seize Jinju, a long-defended fortress in southern Korea, after which they would go on to once again massacre nearly the entire surviving population within.
It has not worked so far, stop doing it. I mean, definition of insanity or whatever, right? It doesn't work. Better change strategy and try to be nice.
But even then, the seizure of Jinju was mostly meant as a symbolic, brutal last act of defiance by the Japanese, as in actuality they were soon forced to leave it behind as well, as most of their armies made their way back to the port of Busan under threat of a new, powerful Chinese offensive. Around Busan, Japan had established a strong defensible position.
Victorian Sea did help in preventing Japanese getting supplies, yeah. Sure.
At which they could entrench themselves, using a series of coastal fortresses known as Wajo, a mighty defensive network that even the Chinese and Koreans dreaded to assault, knowing it would result in the further deaths of thousands. So it would be here, where the war initially began, where the first portion of the Imjin War would also come to its climactic end.
Okay.
Toyotomi.
Man, it's kind of like the Korean War, right? I mean, the South Korean army and the UN forces, they got pushed back almost this much as well by China and the North Korean, like almost to the end of the South Korea.
Hideyoshi's initial invasion of Korea had failed, but surprisingly enough, this was not entirely viewed as a total defeat, at least not yet. Although Hideyoshi would have been in nothing short of an utter state of shock and despair following the complete turning of fate that caused Japan to go from nearly crossing fully over into China to now just holding a small portion of territory carved out along the southern shore. When all was said and done, there was still something he believed he could gain. Japan still held Korean soil and a strong position with which later campaigns could be conducted out of. Although China had eventually intervened, Hideyoshi's armies had crushed the Korean land military and nearly succeeded in claiming the entire peninsula. Peace talks were to come, and in his mind he had won more than enough with which to barter for his new claims. So, what can we learn?
I don't know if I'd see it like that, but sure. Yeah. I guess I'm no king or ruler or shogun, I don't know if I'd see it like that. I mean, okay. Okay, well, part 4. Let's learn now.
With the initial... The spring of 1593, Japanese forces had fallen back to their fortified position along the southern coast, surrounding the area of Busan. With samurai forces entrenched within their Wajo fortresses, China and Korea would agree to organize a ceasefire with Japan, where from there, peace negotiations could begin. With any luck, some semblance of peace and order could be restored between these nations. Begrudgingly, the Japanese commanders within Busan were left with really no other choice than to accept this truth, being completely unable to do anything other than dig in and defend if fighting was to continue. Thus, they would in turn put down their arms and proceed with peace talks. With fighting having ceased, the process began of Japanese troops returning home. In roughly a year's time, the majority of Japanese soldiers would make their way back to the home islands. And while many were glad to be ending the war...
No, I think we'll stop at the end of the Imjin War, so we'll finish everything next time.
And returning home safely. Others were angry towards the man who had sent them there in the first place, believing the war in Korea to be the hopeless dream of an overly ambitious regent. But then again, there were also others like Kato Kiyomasa who felt dishonored in this defeat, wishing to continue...
Oh, I see. I mean, let's see.
The fight,
let's
and
continue for now.
Accepting the ceasefire. Back in Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was processing the recent developments of the war in Korea, having pushed so far, so fast, only to be forced back just as swiftly. But although his dream of conquering Korea and eventually China was crushed, he was not without some shred of satisfaction that his forces still held Korean soil in the south. That, coupled with the many great victories his land military had won, he firmly believed that he had proven Japanese might and won enough influence with which to barter for new claims. Settling for further dominance over the Korean peninsula was surely not what he had initially dreamed, yet it was still something, justification for the campaign, and a reason for all the Japanese lives that...
I really feel like he's really lost it. I mean, at least the way it's portrayed right now, and since he began this whole thing, some of his justification and ideas really seems to be nothing like, when he was conquering Japan. Like, he really seems to have really lost his marble a little bit. Oh, he's only 1 year younger than Nobunaga. Okay, interesting. I always thought he was much younger, yeah. I did not realize that. Yeah.
were lost in the process. By the summer, Ming envoys had arrived in Nagoya Castle of Hizen Province to begin peace negotiations, and it is here things start to take a strange turn. One of the key figures throughout the war who had become a trusted vassal of Hideyoshi was none other than Konishi Yukinaga. Yukinaga understood how dismal the
Ieyasu is 9 years younger. Okay. And he is 2 years younger than Ieyasu.
situation was, having been in Korea himself. Yet he still wanted to find a way to please his lord Hideyoshi. Thus he devised a scheme to try to smooth over the peace negotiations, so that they did not ruin Hideyoshi's mood. So when peace talks finally commenced, Yukinaga was instrumental in tinkering with the entire discussion. Conveying a false reason for why the Japanese went to war, his plan was that Hideyoshi was to believe that China and Korea were surrendering to him, while telling the envoys that Japan was surrendering to them. If this sounds incredibly dumb and bound to backfire,
I don't really know anything about Queen Elizabeth.
you're absolutely right. But for a time, it worked. Hideyoshi is none the wiser. But what is strange is that even while being told that the Chinese were supposedly surrendering, he still understood the gravity of the situation in Korea. He knew that Japan was in a bad position. Still, he gave his demands to the Ming, and they made their way back to the mainland. These demands were known as Hideyoshi's 7 stipulations for peace. They not only cement the continuation of the truce and reopening of trade, but also that Hideyoshi be sent the daughter of the Ming Emperor as a consort to the Emperor of Japan.
Okay.
Importantly though, in regards to Korea, the Korean king...
I'm sorry, but it's really just it. Yeah. I think last stream I said, like, Hideyoshi is my favorite. And I still think, his rise from, like, the very bottom to, the unification of Japan is amazing. But now, I'm not really into his move after, like, unifying Japan. Yeah. He feels like a different person. Famous naval war. Another famous naval war was fought between England and Spain. Okay.
Sonjo should be kept as sort of a puppet of the Chinese, and granted only lordship over the 4 northernmost provinces of Korea, while the provinces of the south should be handed over to Japan, along with other political hostages. The 2 Korean princes who were captured by Kato Kiyomasa are noted to have been treated.
I guess you're right, yeah. Yeah. It's Napoleon, the same thing where, like, he had so many chances to keep his throne if he just accepted, like, giving up this part or of the territory or stuff like that. And, at that point, it's like, you've kind of reached the point of believing too much that, you can't give up anything, you can't say no, you can't say yes to any concession. It feels kind of like that, yeah.
Did well and will be returned home. And in order to ensure a smooth transition without much hostilities from the Korean people, the elders of Korea are to swear that there shall be no violation of peace.
He's asking for way too much.
These terms were not moderate and were rather in the same tone as if he was negotiating with other Sengoku daimyo, not the Emperor of China. And the Chinese envoys were obviously taken aback, especially because they had been told that Hideyoshi was surrendering to them, although it is suspected that they knew all along that there was some foul play going on. The truth was that although the Japanese land military was strong, it was still outsupplied and outnumbered. The Japanese were beaten, yet Hideyoshi was still trying to appear as if he had succeeded in some great triumph, not to mention the fact that he was being made confident by the lies that Konishi Yukinaga was telling him.
I guess the lies are part of it, but still.
But even then, Hideyoshi himself had been no stranger to lies. Ever since the war began taking a turn for the worst, he had begun to lie himself to other prominent figures in Japan that the situation in Korea was not going bad, and rather going well. He had to do this because he had to find some way to spin the story, and make it sound like not a defeat but rather a form of victory. He wanted to make it sound like his armies had done their job, defeating and conquering Korea, as well as defeating the Chinese in major engagements. Partially, this was true. His armies did crush the Koreans on land and push them all the way up to the northern border. and they did beat the Chinese in significant battles, such as at Pyeokjaegwan. He spread word of these great triumphs while leaving out the fact that at sea, his navy was being decimated, causing the situation on land to deteriorate to an abysmal state. The biggest thing was that in this moment of defeat, he did not want to appear weak to those in Japan who may still want to.
I mean, yeah, I still understand that, Obviously, it's not very cool what he's doing, but the whole point, even to start the the Indian War, that's a different war, was because he's afraid of losing his position and his family losing the position. So, of course, he's gonna do all this to try to keep things going well, or seems like it's going well.
Take power from him and his family, someone like Tokugawa Ieyasu. As we have discussed, one of the primary reasons for the outbreak of the war was that Hideyoshi was nervous about the state of Japan going forward, maintaining peace and stability over the nation along with keeping his family atop the country for generations to come. As of yet, he had no heir, not after the death of his infant son Tsurumatsu in 1591. One of his only hopes was the war in Korea, a conflict which would turn the attention of the daimyo away from Japan and away from him, ensuring security at home. But now this war was ending very badly for him. This begs the question, if he really knew how bad things really were in Korea, it makes it all the more puzzling why he believed what Yukinaga was telling him regarding China and Korea's plan to surrender. This may be in fact chalked up to Hideyoshi's mental state, which by this point was believed to be deteriorating.
I mean, seems like it. How would he actually believe that China wants to surrender? Like, you haven't even invaded China. Like, come on.
Eventually, a heavily doctored version of Hideyoshi's demands would be sent to the Chinese emperor, not really asking for any of the things Hideyoshi wanted, but instead requesting that he be made a Chinese vassal, a request that the Ming would eventually accept. In the meantime, the situation in Japan would come to change drastically. Hideyoshi, who by this point had made his nephew Toyotomi Hidetsugu his new heir and successor, was shocked when in the fall of 1593, his concubine...
Spend more time looking at the map and compare Japan and China's size. I mean, I keep making the joke, of the size, but that doesn't really mean everything. Obviously, like in World War II, Japan conquered like over half of China, so like they were never going to win anyway, but still, taking territory is not that hard. But still, holding it is the problem.
Yorodono gave birth to a son, a true heir for Hideyoshi. This boy's name would, in time, come to be Toyotomi Hideyori. This birth brought great joy to Hideyoshi, who now wished for his true son to be his official heir. This of course caused the problem to arise that Hideyoshi had already named Hidetsugu his heir, an issue that had to be dealt with. Over the course of the next couple years, Hideyoshi would work to remove Hidetsugu, who himself was now caught in an unfortunate situation. This was done through a campaign of character assassination, spreading rumors that Hidetsugu was a murderous psychopath, and later even accusing him of being involved.
Said the guy called Hideyoshi would just, send 500,000 troops to, massacre Korea. You're not the murderous madman? This guy is the guy who's just, running the country? Bet, I believe you.
Involved in a potential coup against Hideyoshi. All of this eventually caused Hidetsugu to be sent into exile on Mount Koya in 1595, where he was in time pressured to commit seppuku. Any other daimyo or individual associated with Hidetsugu were also ordered to commit seppuku as well. This would even lead to the execution of Hidetsugu's entire family and household staff, including a number of women and children.
Okay, I'll say it again. This is not the same guy. I mean, he did some fucked up stuff before. Sure, he was never a saint or anything. He was still like a military leader, but I don't know. Like, he's totally lost the plot. This is the kind of move that just creates more resistance against you. You're not like this isn't helping you. China was fighting two separate rebellions at the same time. I mean, classic China, I guess. Fair enough. They're used to it.
Hidetsugu's seat of power as the Kampaku at Jurakudai was also demolished, and much of its materials would go into the building up of Hideyoshi's new castle at Fushimi. All of this worked to completely eradicate any trace of
What if your son dies like the first one died? What if this one dies? Oops, I shouldn't have killed that guy.
Hidetsugu was done to ensure that there would be absolutely no one within the Toyotomi family who would work to undermine the eventual rule of Hideyori. Finally, by 1595, a Chinese and Korean mission was sent to Japan to deliver to Hideyoshi word of their decision and give him his new crown and robes as a Chinese vassal. Hideyoshi was completely unaware that his demands to China had been so misconstrued, and rather he was eager to finally receive the Chinese envoys again and told what he thought would be glorious news. However, in a short amount of time after receiving these items and having the Chinese proclamation translated to him, the ruse was up, and Hideyoshi was furious. The envoys, although nearly ordered to be killed, were instead immediately expelled, and Hideyoshi had to be convinced not to order the death of Konishi Yukinaga, who had lied to him.
I'm surprised. I thought this guy was done.
Instead, he would be convinced that Yukinaga had in fact misunderstood the situation as well. Another lie that would in the end save him his life. All in all, this was a humiliating turn of events for Hideyoshi. Not only did it...
So what, like, now you sending me a message? Sorry, Mr. Chinese Emperor, I kind of messed up my first message. I didn't want to be a vassal, I actually wanted to say, please surrender to me. Like, what do you do now?
China and Korea view him as a defeated lesser foe, but also his defeat was on full display to the other daimyo of Japan. All of this just meant that the war was not over. The truce was going to be broken, and he was going to launch a new offensive, one that wouldn't necessarily aim for some grand victory, but rather showcase his might. So...
It is a crazy turn of story again, like from the very beginning to the conquest of Japan. So many good moves, so many smart moves from him. Strategy, diplomacy, you know. But now that he's done with it, yeah, it's been like dumb move after dumb move. It's such a shame. Such a shame. You know, and clearly there's a lot of reason maybe, like, but it's such a shame. He's really fallen off the deep end, yeah. Yeah. Part 5.
In the last episode, by 1595, following the conclusion of the peace negotiations that had ended so poorly for Toyotomi Hideyoshi, it was clear that conflict was soon to resume. How could he allow such scorn, such disgrace, such insolence? There had to be repercussions. Not only to avenge what he saw as an act of severe disrespect, but also to save face. But there were also other goals in mind.
Almost every battle in Japan.
The dream of invading China was dead. After the failure of the first attempt, it was clear that this wish was indeed a step too far. But Korea, on the other hand, Korea, which had nearly been totally seized by the Japanese in their first invasion, was a far more realistic objective.
But is it, now that China is helping Korea? It doesn't seem like it is realistic.
Even then, before a second invasion could be planned, there were pressing matters that needed to be addressed.
Better navy.
Paramount of which was Hideyoshi's Grand Navy, which had failed to control the seas during the first invasion, leading to the shortcomings on land where the Japanese had initially dominated. The main problems at sea were largely due to Korea having superior vessels, deck weaponry, and far greater naval commanders, such as Yisun Shin. If the Japanese were to have any hope on land in a second invasion, the Japanese Navy would need to be made into a force to be reckoned with. Thus, preparations were made to create better warships instead of relying on retrofitted trade vessels for much of their fleet. Additionally, Heavy firearms and long-range guns would be allocated to vessels to help fill in where proper cannons should have been placed. And lastly, every attempt was made to secure a wider array of sailors with good experience, as there had been a genuine lack of solid seamanship beforehand. It should also be mentioned that Hideyoshi did try to secure Western-style warships from the Portuguese, but the Portuguese opted to stay completely neutral in this conflict, as they did not want to risk harming their trade with China by aiding the Japanese. Without the aid of the Portuguese, Hideyoshi was left to do what he could with what he had at his disposal. And finally, he would come to a point of satisfaction with the state of the Navy, believing it to be strong enough to contend with the best Korea could throw at it. The situation on land needed to be addressed as well, as during the first invasion, a number of problems had arisen with the system in which the invasion had been planned. Originally, the Japanese invasion had been separated into 9 semi-independent divisions, each with a base objective but little else to guide them. This led to bits of confusion along with a lack of coherence. But worst of all, it also indirectly led to competition between rival daimyo, such as figures like Kato Kiyomasa and Konishi Yukinaga, who were each on separate crusades for glory. To remedy this issue, the second invasion would only be comprised of 2 separate armies. The Army of the Right, built up of figures like Kato Kiyomasa, Mori Hidemoto, Kuroda Nagamasa, and Nabeshima Naoshige. And the Army of the Left, including figures like Konishi Yukinaga, Shimazu Yoshihiro and Shimazu Tadatsune, and Ukita Hideye. As mentioned, the dream of marching on China was over. Instead, these armies would be solely focused on seizing Korea. But while Japan had been focusing on using their findings from the previous invasion to better their next offensive, the armies of Korea were doing the same, realizing their past failures that had led to their poor performance against the Japanese in 1592 and 1593. Korea completely restructured its land military into a more efficient fighting force, creating stronger divisions and corps with a more concrete chain of command. To top it all off, the system of conscription was also completely overhauled to now be made compulsory for all males throughout Korea, regardless of social status. Additionally, Korean fortifications were also rushed to be repaired or completed, erecting new lines of defenses and installing as many defensive cannons as could be produced. All in all, the Korean military became a far better structured, equipped, and entrenched force, one that would be far harder to defeat than ever before. By 1597, Japan's preparations for a second invasion were nearly complete, as far as Hideyoshi was concerned, and in his mind he must have thought at not a moment too soon. By this point, his health and mental condition were deteriorating at a rapid pace, and he knew it. Although he now had a true heir in his son Toyotomi Hideyori, who we saw born in the previous episode, the Toyotomi regime stood at a somewhat unstable point, following the failure of the first invasion that, if successful, could have cemented his legacy. In reality, alongside his anger and embarrassment, there was also likely just as much fear that a second failure would be the doom of his family name, and those wishing to seize power in Japan would use it as an excuse to overthrow the Toyotomi clan. He needed a victory. He needed the subjugation of Korea, and he needed it as soon as possible, or all would be for nothing, and the stability of his family's future would be called into greater question. On August 27, 1597, the second Japanese invasion commenced as a force of roughly 700 ships ferried almost 100,000 Japanese soldiers back to Korea to begin a new offensive. Landing in their fortified area surrounding Busan, the samurai armies quickly began a second blitzkrieg up the peninsula, much like their first attack 5 years prior. And although Korea was better prepared for this assault, the overall explosive power of the Japanese attack managed to still break through. But even as Japan pushed forth and seized key strategic locations, they once again found themselves caught up in bitter guerrilla warfare by Korean defenders. Understandably, just as before, all this initial success by the Japanese would mean nothing if the war at sea was not won.
But again, in just a couple of years, they don't have the time to build a navy to the level and catch up to the technology of the Korean Navy.
And luckily for the Japanese, the famed Korean Admiral Yi Sun-shin was currently inactive. Yi Sun-shin had been accused of being a spy for the Japanese, an outlandish idea in retrospect, but during this time of imprisonment and interrogation, he would be absent from the Korean fleet, as it now raced forth to meet the Japanese. Led by Admiral Won-gyun, the Korean Navy of around...
They should do that, some kind of like alternate story. I know that the Napoleon game was alternate story where you can try to conquer England or something. They should do that where like you can try to conquer China.
200 vessels would engage the massive Japanese fleet at the Battle of Chicheolyang near Busan. And although Korea had so far held naval dominance over Japan, this time around, the Japanese fleet under the command of figures like Toro Taketora and Shimazu Yoshihiro were able to launch a successful surprise attack. This would prove to be a massive victory for Japan, sinking as many as 188 Korean vessels, completely crippling their fleet. This could have very well paved the way to Japanese dominance of the sea lanes, allowing for a steady stream of supplies and reinforcements to make their way to Korea. Yet, as we will soon come to see, this victory would be short-lived.
Yeah.
In shock and fear after the massacre of the Korean Navy, the Korean King Sonjo immediately released Yi Sun-shin and sent him back into active duty. With only 12 or 13 remaining ships at his disposal, Yi Sun-shin was determined to halt the Japanese in any way he could. This would finally result in the Battle of Myeongyang, in which he would lure a massive portion of the Japanese Navy into the narrow and dangerous Myeongyang Strait. It would be here, using his superior vessels and knowledge of the terrain, he would completely crush the Japanese in stunning fashion, adding to his legend and list of accomplishments. The Japanese would lose as many as 60 of their military vessels, while the remaining Korean ships suffered barely a scratch.
That's
and for
crazy.
those of you who have not yet watched my recent review of The Admiral Roaring Currents, it is this battle, the Battle of Myeongyang, that takes place in that film.
Oh, maybe I should watch that.
From this victory forward, Korea would once again be in command of the waters. Yi Sun-shin and the Korean Navy, along with eventual Chinese naval reinforcements, would continue to hold dominance over the seas up until the end of the war a year later, at the Battle of Noryang, when Yi Sun-shin would heroically die in combat. But as for now, back on land, as the Japanese war machine pushed forth, China had dispatched an additional 55,000 troops to Korea to aid their defense. Although Japan had seized much of the southern provinces of Korea, by late fall, facing increasingly stiff Korean and Chinese resistance, and now once again suffering from a lack of supplies and reinforcements due to the situation at sea, the Battle of Chiksan would prove to be the furthest north Japan would push this time around. It would be here Kuroda Nagamasa would advance up to meet a much smaller Ming detachment
compared to Trafalgar.
of around 8,000. Eventually, he would be joined by reinforcements that would bolster his numbers up to roughly 30,000. But even though outnumbering the Chinese soldiers, the Ming would hold out for a time. With the Japanese not able to push past them, and the Ming not able to make an attack against such a massive Japanese force, both sides would eventually withdraw, leading to an inconclusive result. Either way, this would be the last major forward thrust by the Japanese, as from this point on, their offensive began to stall out. Still, even then, the Chinese and Korean alliance faced an equally difficult struggle in trying to force the Japanese back, who used many of the captured Korean fortifications and entrenchments themselves. A period of stalemate was beginning to set in. By early 1598, Japan was at last on the back foot, as Korean and Chinese forces were pushing desperately against the Japanese positions. It is here we see the siege of Ulsan, a Japanese-built fortification in the southeast. Surrounded and outnumbered, forces under Kato Kiyomasa would put up a bitter and savage defense of the castle, nearly starving out or freezing to death while facing total defeat, when they were at last relieved by a combined Japanese counterattack which managed to kill as many as over 20,000 Korean and Chinese soldiers who fled.
That's a lot, huh?
In the end, the Japanese victory at Ulsan just prolonged the inevitable. It was mostly clear at this point that the second invasion was over. Japan was unable to make any further attempts north, and instead, they needed to pull out if they were to survive at all. Back in Japan, Hideyoshi, who...
What a mess is all I can say. I mean, what a mess. It's even if, you know, there wasn't like the problem at sea, I really feel like, you know, it would have probably ended the same.
but moved into Fushimi
Obviously, maybe it would have taken way longer, but
Castle, was growing increasingly concerned with the situation. But his alarm was not mixed with surprise. He
Thousands.
understood that this may have been the outcome for his second invasion, and was prepared for such an inevitability. In actuality, it has been said that he may have even believed the second invasion to once again be a success, even though it did not at face value appear to be one. His second invasion had once again showcased the might of his armies, pushing up into Korea and causing the deaths of thousands upon thousands of Korean and Chinese soldiers. He displayed his military power and that his samurai armies could challenge that of China. His largest downfall was once again his shortcomings at sea.
yeah.
By the 6th month of 1598, as Japanese forces continued to hold on to what ground they had left in Korea, putting up stiff resistance against Chinese and Korean assaults, back home,
failed to
Hideyoshi's
win.
condition had taken a turn for the worst.
Oh,
He was dying. In aims to preserve his remaining armies and feeling that they had done their duty in Korea, he began recalling his generals home. Pulling out one by one, the samurai commanders and their armies returned back to Japan, while armies under Kiyomasa, Konishi Yukinaga, and Shimazu Yoshihiro, among others, stayed behind to hold their ground and secure safe passage for those leaving to return home. Korea and China had launched another massive offensive to dislodge the remaining Japanese commanders, but once again, many of their attacks resulted in massive casualties as the entrenched Japanese refused to budge. But even as these samurai commanders continued to put forth a brave and heroic effort against all odds,
It's
their
done.
time was running out. Until finally, by September of 1598, at long last, it happened. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died.
damn.
For months now, the war had been winding down. But with the death of...
I really don't really like him here at the end, right? He made so much stupid decisions, so I have a hard time, you know, like him at the end. But again, I still remember, like, everything from the beginning, when he first showed up as an Ashigaru under Nobunaga. Actually, he was under Shibata, I think, Katsuie, to, you know, rising to the top, conquering the rest of Japan. Yeah, I mean, he had a good run early on. He had a good run.
the Taiko, the end was at last upon them. So,
And that's it. Was great at first, then fell off. I don't really know if he fell off. I feel like what we saw of Nobunaga was mixed. That's why I kind of like Nobunaga, you know, in this series. I used to think of him as like, you know, he always wins or something, but no, what we learned from this series is that, you know, he wasn't like a perfect commander. Like, you know, he lost some battle and sometimes only won some because of his generals. You know, he wasn't perfect, but he still managed to get like great commanders under him. So for the most part, he ended up coming on top in conflict. Okay, well, Hideyoshi is dead, yeah, and the Imjin War was an absolute disaster. I mean, what a mess. What an unnecessary mess too. I mean, that's all I can say, right? 100 years of war, and you know, you finally conquer Japan, and rather than like try to bring peace and prosperity, you know, you start this insane invasion, and it all goes so terribly. And it's mistake after mistake, and bad decision after bad decision from Ieyasu and some of the other people. It's really a shame. It's really a shame. That's really maybe the biggest stain, I guess, in the Sengoku Jidai story so far, I would say. It's really a shame, yeah. Really a shame. It was a totally avoidable kind of thing, right? It really didn't need to happen. And obviously I know that Ieyasu becomes the next ruler of Japan so that the Toyotomi house, you know, lose power. So in the end, like, you know, even his plan of doing this invasion for like strengthening his house literally doesn't pay off. And obviously he wouldn't have done that, but yeah, it's such a waste. Such a waste. like the perfect ending to the Sengoku Jidai would have been Hideyoshi spending the rest of his days, consolidating Japan, keeping the peace, and making sure the country prosper or something. But yeah, unfortunately, that's not what he did. And again, from what we understand, Nobunaga would have done the same if he was still around. That was also potentially his idea. I mean, you never know, he might have changed his mind by now. This is a long time after he died. But yeah, I'll leave it at this episode because tomorrow we are doing more anyway. And I think tomorrow I'll watch everything that's left. I will try to finish everything tomorrow. I mean, we'll see. I won't promise tomorrow is the last one, but I'll try. But yeah, the engine war is definitely very interesting. I think I'll come back to it eventually. I'm sure there's like a lot more to know about the battles. Maybe like kings and generals, right? Yeah, maybe. I also kind of want to watch that kings and general video about the Sengoku Jidai because I assume it doesn't cover much of the politics, but more details on the battles. So eventually, I might go back to that. Yeah. Eventually, I might go back to that. Okay, but yeah, we'll leave it at that for today. Again, tomorrow, big stream. We are continuing. And yeah, that's all I can say. As always, link for everything in the description. Like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for coming. See you.